Hello YouTube. Tamriel's history is full of highly interesting and important characters, from the ever-enigmatic Tiber Septim to the controversial Titus Mede II and the esoteric living gods of Morrowind. Many of them have gotten covered on YouTube and other platforms over the years by many creators. However, despite those Tamrielic celebrities getting quite a lot of coverage, there are a lot more interesting characters in Tamriel's history getting nowhere near the amount of attention, despite being highly interesting themselves. Now, over the past 8 years as a lore YouTuber, I've covered many of these more obscure and lesser known individuals extensively on the channel. And today I put many of them into this big long form lore video for you to enjoy, with timestamps in case you want to skip to a certain character story or if you want to skip anything, like this intro. So, have you always wanted to know what happens when a mortal is raised by Daedra creatures, or who the Imperial Arena champion is in the 4th era? It's all going to be in this long lore video, so join me as we will start talking about one of my favorite characters in the series, the Scarlet Judge, or as I would like to call him, Tamriel's Batman. You'll see why. Imagine a world full of lawlessness, crime, corruption and disorder, and then imagine one man sworn to battle it all. That is the Scarlet Judge. In his own words, vanquisher of evil, guardian of the oppressed, safeguard of the helpless, Vvardenfell's protector. Alright, this masked individual takes it upon himself to crush all the evil and injustice faced by the people of Vvardenfell, and his name is the Scarlet Judge. All Dwemer of Vvardenfell know his legendary attire, his metal mask and scarlet robes, and somehow he manages to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. He goes where justice calls him. Corrupt watchmen and corrupt ordinators call him a scourge, a lawless vigilante, but to the people of Vvardenfell, he is a hero. The Scarlet Judge is the self-proclaimed protector of Vvardenfell. He goes where he is needed and helps the helpless. He is not part of the official law enforcement in any way, operating alone and outside of the law, not defending the law, but defending the helpless. As you can hear, he is the ultimate caricature of a superhero, standing outside of the law and helping the citizenry on his own initiative. But who really is the Scarlet Judge, and what are his motives? Well, to begin, he isn't a single person. The Judge has been multiple people over the centuries who put on the mask and fight injustice. When a Scarlet Judge gets too old or gets injured in the line of duty or maybe even dies, he or she passes on the regalia and the title of Scarlet Judge to another. The old Judge passes into obscurity and anonymity, never speaking of their former identity, and the new one carries on as if there never was a passing of the mantle, like it was always the same person. Like this, the Judge has functioned for centuries, passing on the regalia, giving the people of Vvardenfell the impression that he is some kind of eternal, immortal and undying hero to help them when the law comes short. A corrupt watchman won't release your innocent daughter, the Judge comes to help. Bandits raid your farm and the guards are too busy, the Judge will slaughter them. Illegal slaves being sold by the town constable who has a guard under her thumb, the Judge will deal with it. His reach, in his own words, goes further than the law, and not being restricted by the law, he is able to act quicker and more efficiently than the law. This makes it so that the representatives of the law, like guards, ordinators, constables and counselors and all the others, often brand the Judge as a vigilante, a danger to the peace. But he is no enemy of the people, merely the enemy of the corrupt and evil. By the time of the Elder Scrolls Online, the mantle of the Judge has been taken on by a Dwemer named Belharza. He has the mantle of the Scarlet Judge and he has held it for a few decades now, ever since the retirement of his mentor, Ervona Ules. Ervona Ules was the Scarlet Judge before him and she served Vvardenfell for over 40 years. And in the last 12 years of her serving, she took on Malar as her apprentice. The mentor, Ervona Ules, was for all terms and purposes not a regular Dwemer. She was apparently born to wealth and lived a lifestyle of luxury that she herself or her family had built. But she used that wealth for the betterment of others, using it to help her fellow Dwemer and to finance her position as a Scarlet Judge. When she died in the line of duty, she lay on the ground. And with her last breath, she said to Belharza that he would have to fight on as the Scarlet Judge. And Belharza inherited her wealth and her manor in Serran, and continued her tradition of using the wealth for the good of the people. He used part of the wealth to build himself an actual sort of bat cave beneath the manor, although this basement is less impressive than the actual Batcave. For decades he kept the people of Vvardenfell safe, being especially active in his hometown of Cherim. When he had the mantle, the Scarlet Judge became a sort of local hero, working with the local government and guards when possible, bettering the culture among the guards and the local government. That is, until the local marshal of Cherim got replaced by a new, corrupt marshal, Marshal Hlaren, who deals in all kind of shady business and became the judge's local arch-enemy. The new marshal attempted to catch and imprison the Scarlet Judge. Fortunately, they did not succeed. And you, as the player, can help the Scarlet Judge and his remaining friend within the constabulary to take down the corrupt marshal as part of a quest in Cherim. The quest is actually quite fun, and you should most definitely play it if you're interested. Anyway, during the quest, Belharza, the Scarlet Judge, gets captured by the men of the Marshal Hlaren, and they essentially smash his kneecap so that he can't escape and can't be the Scarlet Judge anymore. You manage to free him, but he tells you that with his new injuries there's no way that he'll ever be quick enough or strong enough anymore to be the Scarlet Judge, so he passes the mantle on to you. Well, he himself decides to retire. This most likely will turn out to be a tragic act, as with every Elder Scrolls protagonist, the Vestige, who is the protagonist of the Elder Scrolls Online, will likely disappear after the story concludes, and since the hero has more pressing matters all around Tamriel, I'm afraid that the line of judges will end here. But of course, it's always possible that in the canon ending for the Elder Scrolls Online they will just write that someone, but not necessarily the player, completed the quest and became the judge. Maybe a canon ending to the Elder Scrolls Online will be that the player from that moment on roleplayed as a Scarlet Judge and all the problems on Tamriel were suddenly fixed by the Scarlet Judge. But yeah, we'll see how things end. We at least know that by the 3rd era there was no more Scarlet Judge because he doesn't appear in Morrowind. Or maybe there was, but we just don't learn of his existence. Anyway, that was the story of the Scarlet Judge. Next up, let's talk about one of the daughters to Tamriel's legendary queen Berenzia, Princess Morgiah, an interesting character from the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, whose lore, unbeknownst to many, got a significant expansion in the later games. That is definitely worth talking about, as you'll see. So, Queen Morgiah, or as we will talk about her in the first half of this video, Princess Morgiah, was the daughter and either second or third child of a general of the Cyrodiilic Empire, the Dark Elf General Symmachus, and the infamous Dunmer Queen, Queen Berenzia, the Queen of Morrowind during most of the 3rd era. She was born in the year 384 of the 3rd era, making her 33 years old when we encounter her in the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall. And as some astute viewers may have noticed, while being born to 2 Dark Elf parents, her Daggerfall sprite looks nothing like a Dark Elf, leading to some speculation in the community that she may in fact be a bastard child or something, but I can refute that right now, as she was fully intended to be a Dark Elf, but the concept of grey skin and red eyes hadn't been fully developed by the time of Daggerfall. This means that in the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, Dark Elves in general just look like regular elves with just a darker skin tone. For example, this is Queen Berenzia in that game. Meaning that in current lore she actually looks more like this photoshopped sprite that I made, which we will be using for the video from now on to remain continuity with the more modern games. On top of all that, in later lore sources she is always confirmed to be a Dark Elf, with it even being quite integral to some parts of her story, but I'm getting ahead of myself here, as we will talk about her later life further up in the video. Anyway, for the first 7 years of her life, little Princess Morgiah led the typical life of a royal princess. She wanted for nothing and her parents were beloved by the people of Morrowind, leading to quite a positive childhood. However, when she was 7 years of age, the Emperor Uriel Septim VII was betrayed by his battle mage Jagar Tharn, who imprisoned the Emperor in a realm of Oblivion and took his place while magically disguising himself as the Emperor, taking over the Empire's rule in the Emperor's stead. Now, this is all part of the lead up to the events of the Elder Scrolls I Arena, where the player unmasks Jagar Tharn, defeats him and frees the Emperor from his captivity. But before the events of the game, the fake Emperor Jagar Tharn allows Tamriel to fall into chaos under his rule. Several provinces descend into chaos, there are wars around Tamriel, and the central government is essentially made lame by Jagar Tharn, rendering it impossible to help the provinces from the center. One such province which erupts into chaos is Morrowind, where mass riots started to occur against Berenzia and Symmachus' rule. This led Queen Berenzia, at that point still unaware that the Emperor had been replaced, to take her children and go to the Imperial City to plead for aid with the Emperor, hoping that the presence of her children at the audience would make the Emperor sympathize with her cause. But it didn't, as the fake Emperor had no intention of helping out her or any of the provinces. To make matters worse, after the audience, Berenzia and her children would learn of the death of Berenzia's husband and Morgiah's father, General Symmachus, who had been killed in a riot, now making it impossible for them to return home to Morrowind, making them practically exiles and royals no more, as Berenzia was forced to cede the throne of Morrowind to her uncle, who was still relatively popular in the province. But the problems for the family didn't end there, as Queen Berenzia had known the Emperor quite well before their audience, and upon their audience immediately suspected that something was awry, and that the Emperor might have either been replaced or maybe under some sort of spell. This was confirmed to her by the King of Wayrest, the Breton King Adwyr, who had also known the Emperor quite well and confirmed her suspicions that this wasn't the real Emperor. They stayed within the Imperial City, with King Adwyr taking the former queen and her children into his household for the time being, and they worked on a plan together to gather intel on the imposter Emperor in order to help out the one who would overthrow him, the eventual player of the Elder Scrolls 1 arena. Once they had done all they could and passed all the intelligence along, King Adwyr took Berenzia and her children with him back home to Wayrest as they silently fled the Imperial City. Once back in Wayrest, the king, who'd been a widower, married Queen Berenzia, making her once more a queen, and making Morgiah once more a princess. This is essentially what we know of Morgiah's childhood. It started off pretty well, but as a child she was forced into a multiple-year exile along with her mother, and lost her father to rioting peasants. Now, despite this, she grew up to be quite a beautiful and intelligent woman, apparently inheriting the shrewdness and intellect from her mother, Queen Berenzia. But it seems that her quite chaotic childhood also left its mark on her personality, as she'd become cold, distant, and often manipulative. Around the time of the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall, she'd garnered a reputation of being a manipulative witch to many of the residents of Wayrest, with those working in the palace describing her of having quite a bad temper. She was aware of and most likely mixed up in most of the court intrigue at this time, and in fact her reputation became so bad that she became somewhat of a problem in the battle for who would succeed King Adwyr of Wayrest after his death, since her half-brother Helseth and her stepsister Elisana were both vying for the throne of Wayrest for after King Adwyr's death, and according to the local peasantry, literally everyone in the city would embrace Helseth as his heir if Morgiah wasn't in the picture as well, to tarnish the family's reputation. I mean, yeah, her reputation was that bad that because of her, the people had doubts for her brother. Now, other than that, not much else is known for her life in Wayrest up until the events of the second game, other than that she has a cat which apparently never leaves her side. Now, during the events of the second game, it becomes clear that Morgiah has no interest at all in the succession battle in Wayrest, but rather has her sights set on another prize, the Somerset Kingdom of Firsthold. You see, the Altmer King of Firsthold, Riemann Carudil, was quite the influential figure around Tamriel at the time, but was currently in mourning as he'd lost his son. So Princess Morgiah arranged an interesting bargain. If she made it so that he could speak one last time to his dead son, the king would marry her, making her Queen of Firsthold, as somehow the king, even though he had a son, he wasn't married, or he was a widower, just like King Adwyr before in the story. Anyway, it's quite likely that she tricked King Carudil, as he most likely thought it to be impossible for him to ever speak to his dead son again, and thus had no realistic intention of marrying her. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here, as the intervention of the player in the Elder Scrolls 2 actually makes this plan work. You see, Morgiah plans to contact the necromancer Mannimarco, the King of Worms, that guy, to use his necromantic powers to make King Carudil able to talk to his dead son one final time. It's you, the player, who delivers their correspondence, revealing that in exchange for doing this, Mannimarco is promised to get Morgiah's first, which we don't really know what it is, but I presume means her firstborn child. But the game never really makes this clear. Although, thanks to the player, this whole bargain works out, and Morgiah enters a 3-year engagement to King Carudil after he was able to speak to his dead son one last time. Now, this engagement is something that everybody in the city is stunned by, as nobody thought anyone would want to marry Princess Morgiah, but it happened. She married the King of Firsthold, becoming his queen, and interestingly it seems that while it may have started as a trick on Morgiah's part, the two actually seemingly made a pretty loving pair, because back home King Carudil sold the marriage to the nobility as a strategic marriage, since Morgiah's brother Helseth may become King of Wayrest and thus this marriage could turn into a powerful alliance, and he then also promised the nobility that if her brother lost the battle for succession, he would not marry her and break off their engagement. But Her brother lost the battle for succession and still the king married her, and the couple ended up having 2 children, Coranthir and Renala, both dark elves. Now, just because her husband apparently loved her doesn't mean that the kingdom of Firsthold liked her. You see, a lot of Altmer or High Elves have always had a little bit of let's say, superiority complex, and likely said do not enjoy it if they are ruled over by someone of a different race than their own. So let's just say that a lot of the locals weren't too thrilled by their new queen, giving her nicknames such as the Alien Queen and the Black Queen. The height of this unrest came at the birth of Morgiah's children, when it became apparent that King Carudil's heirs would be Dark Elves instead of High Elves. Under the leadership of some rival aristocrats, among whom was a woman named Lady Gierlen, who had been promised King Carudil's hand in the past, there was a revolt against Morgiah's rule when the king and his army had left to deal with some pirates off the coast. With barely a soldier left in the city, the rebel militia presumed that it would be a walk in the park and that they would be able to kill Morgiah and her children quickly. With the help of the immensely traditional Trebite monks, the rebels then made their way to the gates of Firsthold. But like I said before, Morgiah had inherited much of the intellect and shrewdness that her mother Berenzia possesses, and as such she was able to use some clever trickery on one of the rebel leaders, feeding them false intelligence, leading to the insurrection to fall into a trap. Now, due to her false intelligence, Morgiah was able to root out the traitorous nobles and, with the help of her husband, exile and execute all of them. Now, we know very little of the further developments of her reign in Firsthold. We don't even know whatever happened to that first, which was supposed to be given to Menemarco, or what it was. Perhaps one of her children was sent to him, perhaps the 2 children that we do know of were actually her second and third child, with the first one being sent away to the King of Worms. I mean, we don't know. But one last thing that we do know is that by the time of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, Morgiah was still reigning in Firsthold together with King Carudil. However, we know that 22 years later, after the game, the Thalmor took over control of the Somerset Isles and killed many of the pro-imperial kings and queens of the Isles and expelled and killed most foreigners of the Somerset Isles. Therefore, we can pretty much be certain that Morgiah has either been killed by the Thalmor together with her children, or she fled the province and is now in exile within the Empire somewhere. Whichever it is, it's very likely that she's no longer Queen of Firsthold, as the Thalmor would never accept a pro-Empire Dunmer on the throne of one of their largest internal kingdoms. So that was basically the story of Queen Morgiah. A pretty interesting story in my opinion, and I personally hope that she somehow survived the Thalmor purges and that we maybe get to meet her in exile in Hammerfell in the Elder Scrolls 6. Who knows, would be cool. Anyway, now let's talk about the only half-vampire that we know to ever exist, the Grey Prince, the 3rd era arena champion of Cyrodiil. So, the Grey Prince, lesser known by his actual name Agronek Malog, is the arena champion that we find in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion and the final boss of the arena questline before we as the players can become the grand champion of the arena. He is one of the most well-known and popular people all around Cyrodiil, with hordes of supporters which comes to the Imperial City from all over the Empire to see him fight, as many consider him to be the greatest fighter on Tamriel at around the time of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. And with good reason, as he's been the undisputed champion of the arena for more than 10 years when we meet him, defeating any challenger, great and small, who'd come to face him, and defeating many monsters and creatures in exhibition battles for glory in the arena. But not only his impressive fighting contributed to his fame, because he is, as far as we know, the only half-orc around Cyrodiil, and unlike the rest of his green-skinned kin, has a grey skin. He's never made a secret of the fact that he's an half-orc, and when he became the champion of the arena, it led him to the title of Grey Prince, a title that he himself finds to be a bit silly, but he remarks that the people of Cyrodiil need heroes and that he's more than happy to oblige and fulfill that role for them. When he's asked about his origins, he is open to people about his history, and he tells you how he's the son of an imperial noble lord who had an affair with his mother, an orc. He tells you that when the Lord's wife found out, she tried killing him and his mother, causing his mother to flee with him. The actions of the Lord's wife denied him any noble titles, but in the arena he strove to be noble in his own right, meaning noble in his deeds, as he respected opponents and he was friendly towards the people that he met and was happy to help new arena participants get on their feet in the system and give them advice. But despite all his fame and glory earned in the arena, he kept being curious about his origins and about his father, as his mother refused to elaborate any further beyond the story she told him about having to flee when the Lord's wife found out. Even when her son became the Grey Prince and one of Cyrodiil's most famous individuals, she wouldn't tell him more. It was only when she passed away, shortly before we can meet Agranek in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, that she told him to go and look for proof of his father, giving him a key which would unlock the secrets to his birth at a castle called Crownhaven near Anvil. Being the Grand Champion of the arena, Agranek had no time to leave the city himself, so when we meet him as the player, he asks us to travel to Crownhaven and bring him back proof of his birth. If we decide to do it and travel to Crownhaven, we find that the castle is completely in ruins and totally abandoned, save for some rats and other foul creatures prowling around the undercroft of the castle. When we search the ruins, we eventually find a locked door which can be opened using the key that Agranek gave to us. Behind it we find a large luxurious room with a feral and starving vampire within who's gone mad with hunger and a lack of blood to feed on. We're forced to kill the vampire, but we can find several written documents by the vampire from before he turned feral, and we can find out that the vampire had been the Lord Lovidicus, former lord of the area and father of the Grey Prince, or so the Grey Prince claims. We can read in his journal that he had actually been a nobleman, but had become infected with vampirism eventually. He tried to cope with it as best as possible and lead a normal life, just like Count Janus Hasseldor of Skiengrad, who was also a vampire, and does the similar thing with trying to lead a normal life. I've also made a video on him, so watch that if you're interested in it. It's in the description of this video. The journal of Lord Leviticus describes the Lord falling madly in love with his orcish servant, Luktuf Gro Malog, the Grey Prince's mother. Nobody around him, including her, knew of his vampiric affliction, and he kept it a secret from everyone, including her, even as they came together and she returned his love eventually. He wanted to tell her of his affliction, but could never muster up the courage, and then something nearly impossible happened. She got pregnant with a child of his. Vampire's fertility is said to be quite low, and the chance of an orc and a human making a successful offspring is also really low, so the chances of this were near impossible, but yet it happened. And the Lord Leviticus knew that he had no choice but to tell her of his affliction now that there was a chance that their offspring would have strange deficiencies, and it'd be better that she knew beforehand, so he told her. But unfortunately for him, Luktuf felt betrayed when he told her, and scared after he told her that he was a vampire. She ran from him and called him a monster and refused to come out of her room for the rest of the day, locking herself in. That night, however, as Lord Leviticus slept, she locked him in his room, in his private underground chamber, so he would never be able to escape, and then she fled from the castle after telling everyone of his affliction. The people of the area fled and avoided the castle, allowing it to fall to ruin. And Lord Leviticus slowly went mad underground out of vampiric hunger, and nobody ever saw him again, until he was slain by the hero of Kvartjes, you the player, come and retrieve his journal. We can bring the journal to Agranek, the Grey Prince, and reveal his origins to him, but if you do, Agranek will wail in despair with the knowledge that he is a half-vampire, and he will fall into a deep depression, seeing himself as a wretched spawn of evil. When the time then comes to face him in the arena, to battle to become the Grand Champion, he will not put up a fight. He will lay down his arms and ask you to slay him, as he cannot live like this, knowing that he's something filthy and evil, begging you to kill him in the arena in front of his adoring fans. It's quite the tragic story with a bitter end for one so glorious as the Grey Prince, and it shows how much people hate vampires in the Elder Scrolls universe, and how being one, or at least part of one, is associated with absolute filthy evil, even if there is nuance to that with people like Count Hasseldor, Serana, and of course Lord Ludovicus before he went mad, demonstrating that it is possible to be a peaceful vampire who lives not to do others harm. It's a shame and a real sad ending to his story. But before ending the video, allow me to mention something real quick, because I once made a video on genetics and procreation in the Elder Scrolls universe. The narration of those two videos is not as good as this one, but watch it if you want. It's also in the description. Anyway, those videos explain how when people in the Elder Scrolls universe have children, it will always have the race of the mother, or at least a really high percentage of chance that it will have the race of the mother. Half-breeds are very, very rare, but the story of the Grey Prince shows that how if one parent is a vampire and the other isn't, that it will actually influence the child and make them half vampire in the Grey Prince case, or at least give them vampiric traits affecting their appearance, even if the mother is no vampire. Which is curious, as usually the child inherits the racial abilities and qualities fully from the mother, so that's quite interesting, in my opinion. That said, that's about all the information that I can give on the Great Prince, the 3rd era arena champion, but let's stay on the subject of arena champions for now, and let's talk about the 4th era arena champion, a man named Martius Silius, a man who went from war criminal to arena champion. Martius Silius is the main antagonist of the new Elder Scrolls Blades arena questline. He has been the champion of Cyrodiil's arenas through tournaments 8 times now, in the years since he became a war hero in the Great War. You first hear of him when talking to Nura, a former arena fighter who settled down in your town and who invites you to join the Grand Invitational Tournament on her team, and maybe even face off against Martius in the finals under the gaze of the Emperor himself. You agree to participate in the tournament and fight your way through the first rounds of the arena, but as you're fighting, something strange starts to happen. When you return from one of your first fights, your sponsor Nura tells you that a member of Martius Silius' team by the name of Volsianus has been murdered. Nobody knows who the murderer was, and Martius Silius refuses to talk about it and instructs everyone in the tournament to continue the tournament as if nothing happened, no matter what. Martius and his team then keep to themselves a lot, and it's said that they become very cruel in the arena, more so than other fighters. Despite Martius' insistence that no one should investigate the murder, you start to investigate the murder by asking around to the other participants, to ask if they'd seen anything. By asking around, you find out from a fellow combatant called Ariel Tremont that Martius and his team all used to belong to the same Imperial unit during the Great War, and that they're all decorated war heroes now. He and his unit got separated from their legion during the last period of the war, after the Altmerry army started their final assault on the Imperial city and captured it in the year 174 of the 4th era. Martius and his men then got stuck behind Altmerry lines, but instead of surrendering, he and his unit started a guerrilla warfare campaign against the enemy. Behind enemy lines, they raided Altmerry camps and caravans, disrupting their supply lines, that way still contributing to the Imperial war effort. Volsianus, the murdered fighter, was Martius Silius' lieutenant back then. When the Empire started their last few offensives, which would lead to the Battle of the Red Ring, the final battle of the war, the 12 of them that had remained after their time behind enemy lines hurried to join the Imperial offensive. They were just in time to join General Decanius' legions and then helped retake the Imperial city itself. When the war ended and their actions behind enemy lines became known to the Imperial command, their unit got personally decorated by the Emperor himself and were honorably discharged from military service. Shortly after that, they entered the Cyrodiilic arenas as a team, and their leader, Martius, became the undefeated champion of the arena tournaments for, well, basically ever since. In the arena, they were known as violent and cruel fighters, but very skilled and extremely popular for their skill. Despite learning this about Martius and his team, your investigation hits a brick wall, and you will need to give up on investigating the murder of Volsianus for the time being. You continue fighting yourself through multiple rounds of the arena until at some point a second murder takes place. This time the victim is a man named Metundus, who was also Martius' team. Once again, Martius insists on everybody just continuing the tournament, just ignore the murder, nothing's wrong. And he wants everyone to leave the murder and their team alone. And once again, being the good Samaritan that you are, you do exactly not that and continue to investigate. During your investigations, you talk to a man named Boragis, who is also affiliated with the tournament. He tells you that he knows that you are investigating the murders and hands you some secret Imperial documents, and then quickly heads off. When you investigate the documents, you discover that they were secret documents from the Imperial archives, documenting the events of a military tribunal court, where Martius and his men stood accused of something terrible that they had done during their legion days in a village called Blackridge. The documents contain no specific accusations, so you decide to go to the village and see if there's anyone there who knows what Martius and his men did back in the day. Once at the village, you find it completely destroyed and meet Boragis there, the man who handed you the Imperial documents earlier. He tells you that he used to be a resident of Blackridge before it got destroyed, now 10 years ago. He tells you that sometime before the war, Martius and his men arrived at the village. They were in bad shape as they had just been dealing with goblins for the Empire, and they demanded supplies from the villagers to heal themselves. The village was already poor and starving due to several failed harvests. Martius then threatened the village elder, and when they refused to share any more materials, Martius simply stabbed the elder to death, and he and his men then destroyed the village and exterminated its population, taking everything the village had in the progress for themselves. The few villagers who remained tried to get Martius and his men in front of a military tribunal to see them sentenced for destroying Blackridge. This was successful and the judges were about to pass a sentence, but just a few days before the sentence could be passed, the Great War broke out. When the Emperor received the ultimatum by the Altmeri Dominion that led to the outbreak of the war, Martius and his men got recalled to the front lines. Suddenly, the whole tribunal was forgotten, and the judge's sentence never came, as the Empire plunged itself into the fires of war with the Dominion. Martius and his men became war heroes, and everybody forgot about Blackridge. Except for Borgis. He never forgot, and when the war came to an end, he affiliated himself with Silverdilic's arenas in order to get close to Martius and the remains of his unit. By the time you, as the player, joined the tournaments, he finally got close enough, and then he started to get his revenge, one by murdering them in their sleep. Once Borgis finishes telling this story, he tries to kill you, because he says that you know too much, and you're forced to deal with him and leave Borgis dead in that ruins of his hometown. When you return to the arena, you're about to participate in the final rounds of the arena fights, but before you start your first match, you go and confront Martius directly. He then admits to you what he did, and that what he and his men did in the village was justified, because the villagers deserved it for not sharing their food. He then proposes that you and he settle it in the arena together. He proposed that if you reach him in the finals, it will be a duel to the death. Show no mercy to him and he wouldn't show mercy to you, and let the story of Blackridge end there, in front of the whole Empire. You don't get the in-game option to disagree, so you agree, and you fight your way to him through the arena rounds. Before you fight him, you fight this guy, a former champion of the arena in the semi-finals. He's apparently the hero of the Battle of Rosegard during the war, a small town on Hammerfell's coast, here. And he fought on the side of the Dominion. This is not related to Martius' story, I just found it interesting. Returning to Martius, we face him in the finals, and as promised, we show no mercy to him, and he shows no mercy to you. You kill Martius in what is supposed to be in the Imperial City arena under the gaze of the Emperor himself, supposedly this shadow that we see here in the arena. And after you kill Martius, everybody is angry for killing him, as he was beloved in the arena. And Nura, your sponsor, basically chastises you for it. You have the option to explain to Nura why you did it, but she will then forgive you, but in the end it doesn't really matter. You become Cyrodiil's arena champion, you get Martius' sword and his helmet, and in the end, being the good Samaritan you are, you avenge the people of Blackridge. I have to say, for the Elder Scrolls Blades' standard, this was a pretty interesting story, definitely one of my favorites in the game. Now, next up, let's talk about Malkur Valos, a second era mage who has the fun quirk of having been raised by the Daedra, despite being a mortal. That makes for quite an interesting story. So, Malkur Valos, he was a member of the Mages Guild back in the middle of the second era, around the time of the Elder Scrolls Online. He was one of their master conjurers, and one of their, if not their, most foremost expert on the planes of Oblivion that the Mages Guild had to offer at the time. For this reason, Malkur would be among those chosen by the Mages Guild to join the player during the invasion of Cold Harbor, which is Molag Bal's Plains of Oblivion, near the end of the Elder Scrolls Online's main questline. This is also the place where we as the player meet him for the first time, as he joins us during that final stretch of the questline. You can help him with some errands in Cold Harbor as he tries to regroup the mages of the guild after they've been scattered during the assault on Cold Harbor and they have been captured by Molag Bal's minions. Now, you can help him free those mages from the minions of Molag Bal, and he will be there to help you during the final assault of the main quest. He is quite a cool character, and he has the ability to transform into a Daedric scamp, which gives him ideal camouflage to explore the Daedric realms, as he's able to fit in like basically no other mage can of the Mages Guild. But probably one of the most interesting things about him is that Bethesda and ZeniMax did not write his backstory. You see, back in 2013, when the Elder Scrolls Online was in the final stretches of its development, and they were finishing up the main quest, this guy was simply known as the Nameless Mage, a young and powerful dark elf who was among the best of the Mages Guild and was hand-selected for the assault on Cold Harbor. Now, ZeniMax then held a contest where the fandom was allowed to submit a name and backstory for the character. The best submission would be chosen on the basis of how good the backstory was and how well it fit into the established lore, and of course, if the name was logical. Now, they would end up reading all of the submissions, and there were more than 5,700 of them. And out of all the submissions, they chose the submission from a Californian named Jim, who named the character Malkur Valos, and gave him quite the interesting backstory, which ZeniMax then put into the game as they put the finishing touches on the Cold Harbor zone. Jim from California gave him the background that he was the only child of the Dwemer mage Maros Valos. His mother died during childbirth, but since his father was too busy being a mage instead of being a father, he used his summoning skills to summon a golden saint, or Oriole as they call themselves. He summoned her to protect his son and care for him like a mother would. Now, the irony is that Golden Saints, who are loyal servants of the Daedric prince Sheogorath in the Shivering Isles, aren't generally too friendly to mortals nor care about them, seeing themselves as far superior kinds of beings. So, I can't imagine this Golden Saint would have been a very kind mother surrogate unless she would have been, under the influence of a spell to make her kind. And yet, when his father Maros was killed while dueling another mage, the Golden Saint actually kept taking care of the infant Malkur Valos. The backstory states that this was out of some sort of commitment to the infant, even though the Golden Saints don't typically care for mortals, although considering that she was summoned, it may have also been possible that his father's spell summoning her somehow changed her personality to be caring for mortals, or maybe bound her to the child, which could actually explain her commitment. It's not specified how exactly this happened. Anyway, what happened was that the Golden Saint took Malkur with her to the Shivering Isles and thus raised him in a realm of Oblivion instead of on Nirn. Now, we know that long periods in Oblivion can actually be very bad for one's psyche, which is why, as we discussed in my video on the Battle Spire, the link to that is below in the description if you want to see it, mortals often need to acclimatize to the realm's influence first. But what I'm getting at here is that this could explain why Malkur can be sometimes a bit unpredictable and erratic in-game, although he mostly seems mentally fine. So perhaps the Golden Saint did take some precautions or let him acclimatize him some way, which is why he has some little quirks, but he's not completely, weird in the head. Or perhaps he just had a very strong mental capacity, or perhaps children react different to the influence of other realms when they're taken in as small children. We actually don't know that. What we do know, however, of his time in Oblivion is that from the Golden Saints he learned their principles of honor, duty and fidelity to one's word, which would come to define him as a person later on. We also know that he picked up vast amounts of knowledge on the natures of the Daedric planes, which led him to become one of the Mages Guild's experts on the Oblivion realms. And we know that he also learned in Oblivion how to transform into a scamp, so he would not stick out too much like I talked about earlier, which actually makes him one of the few mortals which are able to transform themselves into a Daedric form at will. Now, eventually, when he was an adult, he found his way back to Nirn and in turn to Tamriel, where his great magical talent in the arts of conjuration and knowledge of the nature of the planes of Oblivion landed him in a position at the Mages Guild, after Vanus Galarian, the founder of the Mages Guild, personally recruited him. At the guild, he primarily concerned himself with helping the guild with their research into the planes of Oblivion, something which he naturally was an expert on. Now, we also know that during this time, before the game's events, he already ventured into Oblivion for the Mages Guild, as we know that the writer of the Emperor's Guide to Tamriel, which is the big companion book with the Elder Scrolls Online, actually mentions him being in Oblivion at the time the author was also there, and actually appearing to the author, advising him to get out of Oblivion, but actually not helping the author to get out, funnily enough. Anyway, that's where we meet him in the game. Like I said, he plays a role in the assault on Cold Harbor, having been handpicked by the guild to assist with the assault due to his talents and his knowledge. We also just so happen to know that he survived the assault eventually and the final acts of the game, as he eventually seemed to have wed, or at least found a partner, as his backstory states that he is related to Gavis and Ovis Velas, who we can find in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind's Tribunal expansion, so he must have had children of some sort. And that's basically everything we know about Malkur Valos. Quite an interesting character if I say so myself. Now, next up let's talk about a character that many of you will definitely not know about, the Archmage of the College of Winterhold before Savos Aren, who we meet in Skyrim. Archmage Deneth, who got only a few short mentions in Skyrim but had some of his lore expanded significantly by the official Skyrim board game. So, let's talk about his story. So, Archmage Deneth. He was a Dark Elf Archmage of the College of Winterhold who was in charge of the college during both the Great Collapse and during the Great War. In Skyrim itself, he has just one named mention in the book on the Great Collapse, which is simply where we learn his name, and in some dialogue mentions and other lore books where people simply talk about the Archmage, we learn a little bit more about him. Now, one of the things we know he did from the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim is presiding over the college during the Great Collapse, when the Great Collapse took place in year 122 of the 4th era. Now, this was when gigantic waves battered the cliffs on which the city of Winterhold was built for almost a year until the coast completely collapsed. Now, Winterhold used to be one of Skyrim's biggest cities. I mean, the College of Winterhold used to be essentially in the middle of the city, so considering the way it looks now, you can get a picture of how much of the city was lost. Archmage Deneth, who had already known that people distrusted mages after the Oblivion crisis, immediately knew that people would blame the mages of the college for the Great Collapse, especially since the college itself managed to stay relatively unharmed, due to the powerful magics that protected its foundations. He was the Archmage who tried to convince people all over Skyrim, especially in Winterhold, that the mages were not responsible for the collapse, although his success was fairly limited, as by the time of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, the video game, we know that a lot of people do blame the college. Now, we also learned that he was the type of Archmage to have favorite students who he'd let get away with far more stuff than those students he did not consider to be one of his favorites. And it's also suggested that he may have been the last Archmage to have been advised by a member of the Psijic Order, who used to advise the Archmages of the College of Winterhold. Since he's a Dark Elf and thus has quite a long lifespan, meaning that he may have been around as Archmage since before the disappearance of Artaeum in the 4th era. He also may have been the Archmage to get his hands on one of the stones of Berenzia's crown, as those got scattered around Skyrim far before Savos Aren got in power. Around the start of the 4th era they got scattered, although considering that's more than 100 years before the events of the Great Collapse, that may have also been a different Archmage before Deneth, but considering the long lifespans of Dark Elves, it's not far to reach that it was Deneth. Now that's about all we learn about him in the Skyrim video game, but in the new Skyrim board game, which again has an original story approved and checked by Bethesda, so canon, in the final year of the Great War and the year after that, he actually plays a role in that story and is often name dropped. This is actually something that I really appreciate while playing through the game's story, as the writers really did their homework on which characters would be around during the time of the story and who wouldn't be, instead of, just littering the story with fan favorites. And they actually gave them life, these kind of characters, by giving them a role in the story and a whole personality. Because during the story of the board game, we learn that Deneth, unlike his successor Savos Aren, was actually quite vain and arrogant. While under Savos Aren, the bar of entry to enter the College of Winterhold was simply to cast some basic spells, to check whether you are even in tune with magic. Under Archmage Deneth, people really just needed to prove their magical prowess by doing whatever Deneth felt like that day. Which could very much include showing, that you can magically sculpt a rock into a bust of Deneth himself to serve as decoration for the college. We actually know this because this is what we need to do in order to enter the college in the game. On top of that, he can also have a bit of a temperament, and he can be a bit of a coward. I say this because during the main story, which I will cover in a later video, we are in dire need of some help as the player. We come to the college hoping that Deneth will help us, and he will simply say that he's just really not in the mood to help you. And one of the options to actually get him to help you is by cheering him up, by embarrassing yourself, by attempting to juggle. And even then, when he is cheered up, when he hears that you need help with the Daedric Prince, he just tries to get rid of you, as he's kind of scared to go up against a Daedric Prince. When you actually do keep bugging him, he'll say, okay, you know what, I'll help you, but complete this impossible task of trying to convince some of the college's most vocal enemies that we are not responsible for the Great Collapse. You can actually do this with a really hard dice roll. I mean, the easier option would be to search help somewhere else, but you can try to convince these people, and even if you have high speech skills, it's actually quite a hard dice roll, only to then find out that if you succeeded, Deneth never really intended to help you, as he never really thought you'd be able to do it, and he's just too scared to go up against the Daedra for some reason. So when you return, he once more tries to get rid of you instead of help you, and you then have the option to go beg, cry, and plead with him to please help you as the powerful mage that he is. A second really hard dice roll then needs to be undertaken, and if you somehow complete that, he will sympathize with your crying, but he still will not help you, as he is just too afraid for the Daedric Prince, and instead tries to get you to bugger off by trying to help you in a different way, either by teaching you a powerful spell, give you a decent enchanted item, or offering to send one of the college mages with you against the Daedric Prince instead of going himself. I mean, honestly, that was a pretty funny part to play, as there are way easier methods to complete the story and get the information that you need, but I just wanted to bother this guy, although it was kind of a pain in the ass to, get all the correct dice rolls. Anyway, despite all this, he is not just some incompetent asshole. I mean, he is quite proficient in magic and is able to teach you quite useful spells, and near the end of the Great War, he's even willing to shelter X-Blades inside the College of Winterhold against the Thalmor. Basically, these blades all were accomplished mages that could help with the college's research work in exchange for their freedom. Now, we don't know for how long Deneth remained in charge after the Great War. By the time of the video game, obviously Savos Aren has been in charge for quite some time. But considering he was there during the Great Collapse up until at least a year after the Great War ended, we know that he must have been in charge of the college for at least 54 years. Maybe more, considering the long lifespans of the Dark Elves, and as such it's actually quite likely that he may have even hired people like Tolfdir who've been at the college for a very long time, presumably before Savos Aren became Archmage. Now, that being said, that's basically all I can say about Archmage Deneth. Next up, we're talking about a set of 3 characters, 3 emperors to be precise, the Longhouse Emperors. While all attention on YouTube often goes to the Riemann, Septim and Mede dynasties of emperors, the Longhouse Emperors are often forgotten. This obscure house of Reachman Cyrodiilic emperors ruled over Cyrodiil during the Second Era and have quite the interesting backstory, as you'll see. It was the year 533 of the Second Era, a little over 100 years after the fall of the Second Cyrodiilic Empire, which had been started by the Dragonborn Riemann Emperors. Now, in this year, a new imperial dynasty, a very short-lived one, was founded in Cyrodiil when the Reachman warriors under the Reachman chieftain Durkrach the Black Drake overran the province of Cyrodiil and conquered the imperial city, putting their chieftain Durkrach the Black Drake on the throne of the imperial city, proclaiming him emperor of a new great empire, which consisted of Cyrodiil and the Reach. Now, this new emperor, Emperor Durkrach, would be the first of the imperial dynasty which has come to be known as the Longhouse Emperors, a line of 3 emperors which ruled for around 50 years and consisted of the first emperor, Durkrach, his son, Emperor Morgiah, and his son, Emperor Leovic. This dynasty was the first period of stability that Cyrodiil experienced since the start of the chaotic interregnum after the fall of the Second Empire, and it's honestly one of my favorite pieces of lore, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. To start at the beginning of the dynasty, we know relatively little of the first emperor of the dynasty's history before he became emperor. During his reign, he authorized a biography of sorts, but that biography is almost as reliable as approved biographies of North Korean leaders, as Emperor Durkrach's official biography states that a comet blazed across the sky on the night of his birth. Flocks of silver swans flew over his mother's house, and everybody who saw the little baby was awestruck by his strong beauty and his warrior's gaze. And that he killed large predator animals with spears when he was just like a 3-year-old toddler, so yeah, that biography is not too reliable. In truth, we simply don't know much about his childhood, and the only slightly non-glorified sources that we have basically start in his early 20s, when he was just a minor chieftain of a small clan of Reachmen among far bigger clans. But Durkrach was clever, and over time he managed to enlarge his clan and make alliances in the Reach, which led him to slowly becoming one of the major figures in the Reach. And for all terms and purposes, he would have stayed that way, just a powerful chieftain in his own right, but quickly forgotten in the volatile and tribal environment of the Reach, in which oral storytelling is the main part of storytelling, so not a lot of history is written down. But Durkrach wanted more, and allied himself with powerful witchmen and made pacts with Daedric princes to gain more and more power until he was able to subjugate all of the Reach. Now, it's important to note here that from all the sources that we have, we can relatively surely say that Durkrach was never a very devoted Daedra worshipper, as it's said that he made many pacts with Daedric princes during this period, but he was more of an opportunist. He never was a real worshipper, rather just using these pacts to gain more power. And that's important to note, as this explains why, for example, he never transformed his clan or later empire into an all-out Daedra cult, as he never really seemed to openly worship, but rather he just made pacts with Daedra in secret to gain power, and then kept them secret when he got certain power or allies, getting defensive about it when people would claim that he didn't do all that stuff himself. And that gives some insight into some of the insecurities that he has and that he would keep having during his reign. Because when Durkrach had united the Reach, he wanted even more. He wanted to become the greatest Reachman leader to ever exist, and his eyes started wandering south to Cyrodiil. Now, one of the very few things that I'm personally deigned to believe about his youth is that he was enamored in his youth with imperial culture, or rather with imperial strength, as he didn't really care much for the fine culture and literary traditions of empires past, but was rather enamored by their military prowess and their strong rule over massive amounts of land, more land than any Reachman had ever ruled. And thus he started planning a conquest of Cyrodiil, dreaming of founding his own imperial dynasty. He then amassed thousands of Reachman warriors in preparation for an invasion, and in secret used the connections of his Witchman allies to contact the so-called Order of the Waking Flame, who were worshippers of the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon. the Daedric Prince of Chaos and Destruction. Now, this cult brought him into contact with the Daedric Prince himself, and Durkarach then made the ultimate bargain with the Daedric Prince of Destruction in secret. Mehrunes Dagon promised Durkarach the loyalty of his cult and his followers in Cyrodiil, some of whom had very high positions in the Cyrodiilic nobility, which ensured that when Durkarach conquered the province he would actually have enough support to become emperor and establish a stable rule. Now, in exchange, Durkarach pledged his and his successor's services to the Daedric Prince, who instructed him to create 4 Daedric weapons of immense power, which would be called the 4 Ambitions of Mehrunes Dagon. With these 4 ambitions, Mehrunes Dagon would be able to fuse his own realm with Nirn and promise Durkarach and his heirs the eternal rule over all the mortals when the realms would be merged. Durkarach agreed to the pact, as the opportunity to rule all mortals was of course very enticing, and he invaded Cyrodiil with his Reachman warriors, and as they overran the province, the cultists of Mehrunes Dagon and his followers in high places ensured that the Cyrodiilic nobility would accept Durkarach as a ruler once he had conquered the entire province of Cyrodiil. The pact with Mehrunes Dagon was kept secret to everyone, except for a select few who would be working to create the Daedric weapons, and as such, Durkarach's rule began. Now, his rule was characterized by contrasts, as on one hand Cyrodiil's new emperor was still a barbaric chieftain, easy to anger, no caring for fine culture, and according to some even illiterate, as he apparently couldn't read, but that could also have been slander by his political enemies. I mean, a barbarian who can't read is an easy caricature to make up. But we do know that he had no formal education of any sort, so make of that what you will. So on one hand he was barbaric, but then on the other hand he seemed to understand that the barbaric ways of rule of the Reach, based on clans and chieftains, wasn't suitable for a Tamrielic-wide empire, which was his dream. So partly to please the Cyrodiilic nobility and partly out of his own desire to create something to last, something stable, he took on many Cyrodiilic practices. He created a new Elder Council of Nobles to advise him, just as the Reman Emperors had done, and he also tried to take on many imperial protocols and truly make himself an imperial ruler while still embracing his Reach heritage, as he never tried to hide where he came from, but he did try to reconciliate the two cultures in himself to make his rule a success. A really telling account comes from the memoirs of one of his aides, who writes that all the aides of the emperor were scared of Durkarach's temper, but they also really respected and sympathized with him because he tried really hard to understand imperial court protocols, and he demanded that people would teach him how an emperor of Cyrodiil was supposed to carry himself, despite being constantly frustrated with the culture and not understanding a bit of it, but he really kept trying and pushing through, earning the respect of his imperial aides at the very least. He also married Clivia Tharn around this time, a member of the powerful Cyrodiilic Tharn family, to embrace more of an imperial culture and show this to his new people about how he truly wanted to be a ruler for everyone and unite the two cultures rather than become a barbarian despot ruler. His official biography also shows this, as there he has himself described as the savior of Cyrodiil and a savior of Cyrodiilic culture, a barbarian who came from the north respecting imperial culture who wanted to save it from the chaos and the rule of corrupt elites that it had landed in after the fall of the Reman Empire. It's also during this time that the name Longhouse Emperors seems to have surfaced first. Likely it was first a mocking nickname of sorts that the nobles in opposition called Emperor Durkarach, mocking him for his barbarian roots. But it seems that Durkarach actually embraced this nickname, and he would call himself the Longhouse Emperor, a nickname which mirrored the way that he wished to be seen, with the Longhouse as a symbol of his roots and the title of Emperor as a sign of his embrace of imperial culture. But for all his trying, according to his aide, he never fully managed to embrace the culture himself, as he would always remain a Reachman at heart, sticking to some Reachman rituals and never truly being at ease in imperial court culture, which also meant that to an extent he was always insecure over his own legitimacy as ruler, as he never felt at home at his own court, although it does seem that the Cyrodiilic people were generally happy with him. Or rather, they were happy with the stability that his rule brought to Cyrodiil after a little over a century of infighting. And they also saw promise in his son, Morgiah, a boy born to a previous wife of Durkarach's, who had been born in the Reach but spent his teens getting educated under the best imperial tutors, including members of the Elder Council. Now, this meant that Prince Morgiah, despite being heavily influenced by the culture of the Reach, knew how to carry himself and had a feeling for the imperial politics that his father never could have had. This promised a strong successor and thus a promising outlook for Durkarach's dynasty. And this proved true, as when Durkarach attempted an invasion of High Rock, a region that he presumed to be easy to conquer due to it being fractured in many different quarreling kingdoms, He failed terribly when the kingdoms of High Rock united into the first Daggerfall Covenant, consisting of the kingdoms of High Rock who united against a foreign aggressor. Now Emmerich, who was then simply a noble general serving in High Rock's armies and not yet a king, is said to have slain Emperor Dyrkrach himself before the walls of Daggerfall, which was a crushing defeat for the Empire. But with Dyrkrach dead, it was Morgiah, his son, who took the throne. Allegedly, Morgiah ensured a swift transition of power with the help of the followers of Mehrunes Dagon in his cult, as Morgiah pledged his life to the cause that his father had used to make himself an emperor. You see, the construction of the four ambitions, the weapons that Dyrkrach has promised Mehrunes Dagon in exchange for power, had begun, and Morgiah vowed to finish what his father had started for Mehrunes Dagon. Now, Morgiah also kept his pact with the Daedric prince secret to the people, and to the outside he was a far more imperial ruler than his father had ever been. Many saw him as a strong and capable man with a good set of brains and his barbarian roots blunted by years of imperial education. He was a man who understood nuances and diplomacy, something which showed in the first weeks of his rule when, rather than fighting till the bitter end in High Rock as a chieftain would, he made a pragmatic peace with the first Daggerfall Covenant, which led him to keeping parts of High Rock and establishing political connections with the other half of High Rock. This all despite his generals assuring him that he could win the entire war with some more effort, but he saw more benefit in a diplomatic solution. Now, like his father, he was proud of his Reach heritage and never really tried to hide it, trying to unify both cultures, taking the good from both and presenting him to the people as a Longhouse Emperor, taking his father's nickname, keeping both Imperial and Reachman leaders on his staff of advisors as well. Now, during this time he also fathered his first son and apparent heir, Leovic, a child that he had educated in both the ways of the Reach and the ways of the Empire, hoping to keep their original heritage alive while also creating a capable ruler over the Imperial Empire. During this time, Emperor Morgiah also worked extensively on bringing the ambition weapons of Mehrunes Dagon to life, but we will talk about those plans in detail near the end of the video, just so people who want to play the story of the Elder Scrolls Online Blackwood can watch this whole part without spoilers, except for those things which were already told to us through trailers and general outlines. Anyway, Morgiah's rule was relatively stable, although he did have the challenge of having to deal with the Knaten flu, one of Tamriel's worst diseases and plagues, which absolutely decimated the continent's population for a bit. I made a video on the entire plague and everything around it, if you want more details about that part of history, and that video is in the description. However, it seems that the Empire under Morgiah deals relatively well with the Knaten flu. We don't know many details about how he dealt with the flu, but we do know that the Empire, as a result of his rule, was in relatively good shape compared to other provinces of Tamriel during the flu. Because we know that during his time, the Empire managed to conquer most of North and elsewhere, making use of the weakened state of the Khajiit people who were hit especially hard by the Knaten flu, meaning that Morgiah was able to use this weakness by overrunning North and elsewhere and incorporating it into his empire. Emperor Morgiah then attempted to execute that same trick again by attempting an invasion of western Skyrim, which was ruled by High King Svagrim, believing the kingdom to be weakened by the flu and conveniently surrounded by the Longhouse Emperor territories on both the west and the southern side. Now, Morgiah likely assumed that it would be as easy as elsewhere, but it wasn't as easy as he assumed it would be, as High King Svagrim had his troops flee from Morgiah's troops and retreat back to the city of Solitude, where High King Svagrim had his combined forces fall upon Morgiah's armies, which absolutely decimated the Emperor's troops and left the Emperor himself gravely wounded. His wounds were so severe that no healers could save him, leading to his death and immediate succession by his son Leovic, last of the Longhouse Emperors. Now, Leovic was at the beginning perceived as a very promising young prince, and when he ascended to the throne, perceived as a promising young ruler. He was born in imperial culture and had never even been in the Reach, and for all terms and purposes he was an imperial. He didn't deny his heritage and did embrace it, as he had been educated in the ways of the Reach and had Reachman figures on his advisor council. However, just like his father, he wasn't particularly barbarian in nature, and he was a skilled diplomat and politician in his own right, as he was very well educated, by some even considered to be a bit of an intellectual emperor. He made peace with Skyrim and steered his empire through the closing years of the Knaten flu, and he also married a Tharn family member, Clivia Tharn. However, as the years went on, the so-called intellectual emperor started to embrace his Reach heritage more and more, possibly out of criticism by some Reachman leaders who would call him weak, overeducated and spoiled. At court, this at first started very small, as Emperor Leovic introduced small changes, like the kitchens adding Reachman cuisine to its menu, but slowly his obsession with his heritage became larger, as he started traveling across the empire to promote the culture of the Reach in imperial counties, which wasn't very appreciated by the people. Around this time he also intensified his work with the Order of the Waking Flame, the Mehrunes Dagon worshippers, who had made sure that Leovic had continued the pact of his father and grandfather with Mehrunes Dagon to develop the four ambitions. And unlike his father and grandfather, he apparently was swayed by Mehrunes Dagon worship, and he was somewhat of a real believer. This all culminated in Leovic eventually openly having shrines to Daedra princes in the White Gold Tower, and eventually against the council of his advisors, legalizing Daedra worship in the Empire. And that was the final straw for the people of Cyrodiil, as former allies led by one of Leovic's original supporters to the throne, the Colovian warlord Duke Farron Aquilarius, started rebelling against the Emperor. Within a year the rebellion's forces had surrounded the imperial city, and after a short siege Emperor Leovic was deposed by Duke Farron Aquilarius, who then took the title of Emperor after slaying Leovic inside the imperial throne room, and then throwing his body down the imperial sewers. This freed the empire of their Daedra-worshipping emperor and brought the Longhouse Empire to a close, and setting in motion the events leading up to the events of the Elder Scrolls Online, which you can see in my video recapping the major plot points and background lore of the main quest of the Elder Scrolls Online. It's a good video, so I recommend you watch it. It's also in the description of this video. However, the death of Emperor Leovic isn't the end of the story, as the legacy of the Longhouse Emperors would cause more trouble than anyone anticipated down the line. First of all, Emperor Leovic's body, which was thrown down in the Imperial City sewers, was actually zombified by Mannimarco's cultists, and you can then fight his body in the Elder Scrolls Online's Imperial City sewers. But second, and more impactful, we actually still had that pact with Mehrunes Dagon, which would cause a lot of trouble down the line. Now, here it is that I recommend you stop watching if you wish to play the Elder Scrolls Online's Blackwood and Deadlands DLC, which I recommend because the stories of those DLCs are pretty good. Now, I won't spoil the entire story of those DLCs, as I will probably make separate videos on those DLCs down the line, but major historical discoveries and major plot points will be talked about, so consider yourself warned. So, in order to be guaranteed the Ruby Throne and the enduring rule of his line, Emperor Durkarach made a deal with the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon. Durkarach would create weapons for Dagon on Tamriel, which would allow Dagon to merge his plane of Oblivion with the mortal plane, so he would be able to rule both planes, while Durkarach and his heirs would be allowed to play at Emperor, ruling all mortals in a Dagon-ruled world. Now, what kind of weapons did Dagon commission? Well, no weapons, as it turns out, although that is what everybody is thinking before the questline starts. You see, Mehrunes Dagon provided Durkarach and Morgiah 4 pieces of his so-called egonymic, which simplified are parts of his essence. The Longhouse Emperors were then to make it so that 4 mortal children would be born under very specific rituals. Each of these 4 mortals would be imbued with a part of the egonymic, so part of Mehrunes Dagon's power, in their mother's womb. Then, due to a couple of complex rituals at birth, those mortals' fusion with Dagon's power would be completed. These 4 mortals then had to be allowed to grow and had to be trained in special contained environments where their own mortal powers linked to the mortal plane would in essence be fused with Dagon's Daedric power within them, creating an interesting overlap of magical energy between Dagon's Daedric power and the mortal realm. Now, these individuals would need to be trained intensely in order to make sure their power grew as much as possible to make the amount of power from both sides as big as possible. Most of this work was done under Emperor Morgiah, who led the Order of the Waking Flame experiment on these children in a vault under the Imperial Palace. On Mehrunes Dagon's instruction, he even fathered one of these ambitions himself, with a priestess of the Order of the Waking Flame. Their child, Princess Mayreed, would become one of the ambitions. Now, these children were trained separately from one another in that special vault under the Imperial Palace, which was located partly in Mehrunes Dagon's plane, because these children needed to be raised in a fusion between both planes of existence so that their powers could be attuned to both. The ultimate goal of this big experiment would be to sacrifice these mortal children to Mehrunes Dagon when their mortal powers were fully fused with their Daedric powers, so that Mehrunes Dagon could take back his original power, which now also contained partial mortal power, giving him the power to enter the mortal plane without restrictions because he now too possessed mortal power. That was the plan, however they never succeeded into bringing it into fruition, as before Emperor Leovic could complete the task that his father and grandfather had passed on to him, the rebellion against his rule had started, which led to Leovic scrambling to hide the project from his enemies. So he hid away the 4 ambitions, these 4 children, in special vaults across Cyrodiil, locking them away with a small army of servants who he instructed to complete their training. And then Leovic was killed, and he had no apparent heirs. Varen took the throne and the ambitions were forgotten. But of course, Mehrunes Dagon and his cult would very much like to know where Leovic hid the ambitions, as he died before telling anyone from the cult. And thus, the plot of the Elder Scrolls Online's Gates of Oblivion storyline starts, in which you attempt to find the ambitions and foil Mehrunes Dagon's plans. But there's one final thing that I need to tell you, with some heavy spoilers for the questline, but this belongs in the video about the Longhouse Emperors. This final fact is that Emperor Morgiah wasn't as trusting and opportunistic as his father, and thus in secret he modified the rituals in such a way that if Mehrunes Dagon would ever betray him or his heirs, the 4 ambitions would be able to be used against the Daedric prince to banish him whence he came. Now, how this whole process of using them against Dagon works, we will one day talk about in a video covering the entire story of the Gates of Oblivion. But he was right to make this little contingency plan, as when Leovic died, so the line died and nobody was left to finish the project, and the ambitions were hidden from Mehrunes Dagon and his cult, Mehrunes Dagon decided to torture the souls of the 3 emperors in revenge, keeping them forever imprisoned in the Deadlands, torturing them and fusing them with a piece of infernal iron, so that they would never be able to escape his torment and wrath over failing him and his plans. And that is the story of the Reachman Longhouse Emperors, an interesting little imperial dynasty, and made even better in my opinion by the Mehrunes Dagon connection. Now next up we're talking about someone who could also be seen as a ruler, yet in a very different way. Tamriel's first pirate king, Red Bramman, whose legend has survived for thousands of years. So, Red Bramman. As we can see on his official art, he was an Argonian pirate, and he was one of the most legendary pirates of his era. His actions back then were unprecedented for a pirate. You see, this story plays in the First Era, back when the First Cyrodiilic Empire, or the Alessian Empire, ruled Cyrodiil. They didn't yet have control over any of the southern provinces, which meant that nearly all of the trade that the Empire conducted with the southern regions of Tamriel, which were independent from the Empire, all passed through this region, the Topal Bay, in order to reach the Empire's heart, which is the Imperial City. And you know what that means? Lots of ships loaded with valuables, materials, gold and other treasures. They all pass through this tropical region in the south, and where there's treasure, there's people bound to look at that treasure and think, "Arr matey, that be mine now." Yeah, okay, I can't do this. Anyway, back in the First Era, the Topal Bay became a region filled with pirates looking to steal the Empire's valuables. And none of those pirates was as notorious as Red Bramman, an Argonian pirate sailing the high seas with his trusty crew. It's said that his crew was fiercely loyal to him, and it seems that they had some sort of initiation trials as well to be fully accepted into the crew, which resulted in each crew member tattooing a gust of wind on their face, once that they had been fully accepted into the crew or reached a certain level of respect by the others in the crew. His crew eventually grew massive, with several other ships in his fleet under Red Bramman's command. They raided and pillaged the trade routes of the Topal Bay, and despite significant Imperial efforts to apprehend him and sink his ships, he managed to continually evade the Imperial Navy and then just disappear when they almost got him. He became richer and richer, and he plundered ship after ship. Now, like I said, every time the Empire sent ships to apprehend him, he managed to somehow get away with his ships, just mysteriously disappearing. To the Empire, this was a very big mystery and an even bigger headache, as trade seriously suffered under the raids of Red Bramman and his crew. And it didn't take long for Empress Hestra, the then ruler of the Alessian Empire, to personally get involved and order Red Bramman's head to be delivered to her personally, allegedly setting almost half the entire Imperial Navy upon Red Bramman's fleet. But they wouldn't catch him or his fleet anytime soon. You see, the Empire back then had very little knowledge of Blackmarsh, knowing nearly nothing of its geography, as almost no humans had ever entered the treacherous swamps. But Red Bramman, being a Blackmarsh native, did know the secrets of the swamp, and he knew that there was a river which flowed through the Blackmarsh towards the Topal Bay, which was deep enough to allow ships to sail into the marshes and the bayous. This meant that every time the Imperials were on his tail, he just made some maneuvers and then made his fleet sail into the swamps as they sailed along the river and just disappeared in the thicket. And when the Imperials then reached the place that he entered the swamps, they assumed simply that he disappeared, because they had no idea where the pirates had gone, as they assumed that the swamps and bogs were inaccessible to ships. Now, as Red Bramman's crew grew, so did his power. He eventually founded the Pirates and Bandit Kingdom in Blackmarsh, becoming the first pirate king of Tamriel, with his kingdom laying deep within the swamps along the river from which they could easily enter the Topal Bay to raid more valuables from the Imperials. It was a kingdom of great variety, as pirates of all races joined this mighty crew, with even many humans and elves apparently joining his crew. Interestingly, these humans and elves that joined Red Bramman's crew were some of the first humans and elves to ever enter the deep swamps of Blackmarsh, and the first to ever contact the Argonian tribes of the swamps. And it wasn't pleasant first contact, as Red Bramman, I being a pirate, allowed the extortion and exploitation and enslavement of the native tribes by the humans and the elves in his kingdom. And it's said that this unpleasant first contact with the Argonians of the Marshes was one of the primary reasons why Argonians would remain very wary and distrusting of man and Myr for a very long time after the defeat of Red Bramman. Anyway, after some time, the Imperial Navy managed to discover how Red Bramman and his crew managed to evade capture for such a long time through the rivers and marshes of Blackmarsh. And the Empress then sent an entire Imperial fleet into the marshes to catch Red Bramman and burn his pirate kingdom completely to the ground. This apparently resulted in a long and violent battle, as the Imperial Navy discovered more and more outposts the further along the river they came, until they came to the heart of his kingdom, where eventually they managed to penetrate into the kingdom's very center, where Red Bramman was caught and apprehended by the crew of a ship called the Dominus Fatum, which was part of the fleet sent into the marshes. That ship had apparently run aground during the expedition, but its crew had disembarked and they had roamed the swamps on foot, where they then eventually encountered Red Bramman in the center of his kingdom. They then captured him and beheaded him, delivering his head to Empress Hestra, ending the story of the first pirate king, someone who's driven the empire to desperate measures with his clever plunder and hide strategy. However, as with all stories from the first era, considering it's so long before any of our playtimes, we don't really know how much of these details are actually true and how much of the narratives has been changed by the writers for whatever reason. I bring this up because while we know that Red Bramman existed, what race he was exactly is strangely unclear. In almost all the sources written by Imperials, he's described as a man with red hair, which earned him his name, Red Bramman. While in official art and some other sources, he is an Argonian with red scales, with the red scales likely earning his name. Which of these is true, we don't know. However, an explanation could be that since Red Bramman managed to outwit the Alessian Empire a few times in a time where the Empire had very little knowledge of Argonians, and most people in the Empire saw them as common beasts below man, it's possible that official Imperial records changed him to be a man so that the damage he inflicted on the Empire would be less humiliating to the population, who back then again thought very little of Argonians. It's either that or perhaps a retcon, but explaining those is my day job at this point, so yeah, this race is just quite ambiguous. That being said, that's basically the entire story of the infamous pirate king Red Bramman. His story would remain a legend and an inspiration for other pirates over the ages, with especially the Sea Elf or Marmor pirates of Piandene apparently taking on a few of his tactics and customs. And perhaps, if the Elder Scrolls 6 takes place in Hammerfell and we get a pirate questline of sorts, we might learn more about his legend, but for now that's basically all we know. Anyway, Red Bramman basically became one of my favorite historical figures of Tamriel over the years. However, that was basically his entire story. So, next up, let's talk about arguably Tamriel's most famous Khajiit during his lifetime, Cherim, the legendary tapestry maker. So, Cherim was a Khajiit living in the city of Orcrest in Elsewhere around the end of the Third Era. We don't know whether he was still alive during the events of Morrowind and Oblivion, but we can assume that he still was, as he was a young soldier during the 5-year war between Valenwood and Elsewhere, where he fought in several battles, which was around 30 to 40 years before the events of Oblivion and Morrowind. So, needless to say, the tapestries that I show in this video, which are from the Elder Scrolls Online, are from the Second Era and are thus not Cherim's work, but I need some background footage, just like if you see any Khajiit in this video, it's not him, as we don't know what he looked like. But it's just an example. That said, Cherim got his fame after that war, the 5-year war. Presumably when the war was over, he settled down in the city of Orcrest, where he started to design elaborate tapestries with artwork on them. In this early period of his work, Cherim worked on tapestries depicting contemporary history. It said that one of his first tapestries was a tapestry depicting the Battle of the Heart of Anaquina, the turning point in the 5-year war, where the Khajiit, according to Cherim, got the upper hand in the war. He himself had taken part in that battle, and on the tapestry he had depicted the armies taking part in the battle, even embroidering a picture of himself in the tapestry where he was looting the corpse of one of his Bosmer enemies. That tapestry, the Heart of Anaquina, was one of his first tapestries, which launched him into fame and where people recognized his talent with craft. His speciality, according to the lore that we have, was his color use, which was said to consist of muted background colors and luminous colors used for the skin tones of characters on the tapestries. It seems that his talent was so great and his tapestries he made were so beautiful that he quickly became very famous all around Tamriel, with his tapestries selling for higher and higher prices as time progressed. And it seems that someday there came a point where he himself was unable to keep up with the demand for his work, and so he opened several weaving factories in different places around elsewhere to help make replicas of his work to be sold all around the Empire. This was arguably a good decision, so as from what we hear he became very rich of this business, with replica tapestries selling very well across the continent. But the fact that there were readily available replicas did not stop the demand for tapestries being made by the artist himself. Those made by the hands of Cherim himself sold for exorbitant amounts, with the imperial government owning several, and 10 of them several years before the events of Oblivion, reportedly being in the Emperor Uriel Septim VII's hands, with negotiations going on to obtain 5 additional ones from the artist himself for the Emperor's collection. Cherim had at this point truly become a Tamrielic celebrity, with his name famous all across the Empire, and at the time of his life, he was probably at this point the most famous Khajiit around the continent. At the very apex of his fame, Cherim had changed his work from depicting contemporary events like battles of recent wars to important historical and metaphysical events. We know of works of his depicting the creation of the world by the gods, the exodus of the prophet Valos and his followers from the Somerset Isles, which led eventually to the Dark Elf Society. He also made a tapestry of the Ayleids fighting the legendary Morgiah at the White Gold Tower, and according to one out-of-game source, he made a tapestry, currently in possession of the Imperial government, which depicts a moth priest on top of the White Gold Tower as a dragon circles the tower, with some in the community speculating that this may depict a metaphysical scene taking place during the Middle Dawn or the beginning of it, with the Middle Dawn being the longest known dragon break in Tamriel's history. But that's just speculation based on an out-of-game unlicensed text by ex-Elder Scrolls Wide writer Douglas Goodall, so take that with a grain of salt, as it is out-of-game. But that same text states, however, that Cherim's tapestries evoked a sense of significant form, a real-world aesthetic theory which states that for something to be art, it needs to evoke emotion in its viewer, and even if it's not necessarily beautiful in a conventional way. This could make sense and provide an explanation as to why the people of Tamriel were so drawn to Cherim's work, but again, this came from an unlicensed text, so it may be contradicted at some point, but still, I like the explanation for his fame, and I like the explanation that that's why his tapestries were so beautiful and were so coveted around Tamriel. With that being said, that's basically all that we know about the famous tapestry artist, Cherim. Quite an interesting character, and I really wish we could see one of his actual tapestries. This fresco depicting some concept art of Valos and his exiles may be one of his tapestries, but considering he was famous for color use, I don't really think it is, since it has, I don't know, it's very faded and it's, you know, called a fresco in the concept art, so I don't really think it's a tapestry, but it might resemble some of his tapestries. On the other hand, I think that considering his legendary status, we'd best never really see one of his tapestries, so they can continue to speak to our imagination. Considering their mythical status, I think that whatever texture either Bethesda or one of their other studios comes up with for a tapestry could be underwhelming, maybe. Anyway, that was the story of Cherim, the legendary tapestry maker. Up next, let's talk about the last living Ayleid that we know of, King Leloriaran Dainar, last king of the Ayleids, and due to his unique situation, last living Ayleid as well, whose story is definitely worth telling. So, King Leloriaran Dainar, last king of the Ayleids or Wild Elves, and his name literally translates to ruler in dark times. He was given this name by his father, the king of the Ayleid kingdom of Nanalata. The name was fitting, as Leloriaran was born in the early late Ayleid period, the period where the Ayleid kingdoms of Cyrodiil were locked in a deadly war with the Proto-Imperial Needs, the humans, who would later become the Imperials. And these Proto-Imperials were winning this war at a rapid pace. You see, for centuries the Ayleid elven kingdoms of Cyrodiil had enslaved the humans ever since their arrival to Cyrodiil from the north, something the humans were not particularly happy with. So one day the humans rebelled, in a large-scale rebellion known as the Alessian Slave Rebellion, which was led by the slave queen Alessia. This rebellion was wildly successful, and with the help from the Nordic Empire of the North and Skyrim, some demigods and some Ayleid kingdoms who had sided with the humans, the Proto-Imperials managed to wrest control of Cyrodiil from the hands of the Ayleids and founded the First Cyrodiilic Empire, also called the Alessian Empire, under their new empress Alessia. who was formerly the slave queen who led the rebellion. Now, it's important to see these events in their full context, so if you didn't fully follow the criminally short recap of history which I just gave, I recommend checking out my Introduction to the Elder Scrolls lore video, where you can see these events in its full context. That video is in the description, just like every other video that I referenced during this video. Anyway, the kingdom of Nanalata, where Lelorion was born, was among those Ayleid kingdoms which sided with the Alessian rebellion and survived the long civil war. Why they sided with the rebellion is unknown, as the kingdoms which sided with the humans had various reasons, from theological differences with the other Ayleid kingdoms to simply seeing on time that it was a losing war for their kind and thus siding with the winning side. These kingdoms which sided with the Alessian rebellion actually flourished even after the might of the Ayleids was broken in Cyrodiil. Some of these kingdoms were even given new lands by the now Empress Alessia, and like I said in my video on the Elder Council, when Alessia formed an Elder Council to advise her, the vassal kings of the Ayleids were likely on that council as well. During this time, the kingdom of Nanalata was making a transition to a new kind of economy, which was not based on free slave labor from enslaved humans, which was likely one demand for the kingdom to be able to survive as a vassal kingdom in the Empire. Now, from the memoirs of Lelorion and Dwemer, we learn that this was a retching process, which likely was quite painful for the city-state, and at the same time the Empire forced them to adopt the imperial Alessian pantheon of gods, so the 8 divines, throwing the kingdom into a theological transition as well. This was a period of rapid change for the kingdom, and most of it happened before Lelorion became king and his father was still on the throne. But eventually Lelorion ascended to the throne. And like his name, ruler in dark times, prophesied, his rule was not an easy one. As the start of his rule coincided with the rise of religious extremism in the Alessian Empire, you see, after the death of Alessia and her immediate successors, which were quite tolerant, a new religious sect in the Empire called the Alessian Order started to become ever more powerful and prevalent in the Empire. To be very short about it, the Alessian Order were convinced that the dragon god of time, Akatosh, was the only god worthy of worship, although they did tolerate the worship of the 8, but more importantly for our story, they absolutely despised elves, especially the Ayleids. And over time, this religious order became almost a militia in the Empire and started to hold pogroms against the Ayleid kingdoms in the Empire. At this point, the order had become so strong that even the Emperor could no longer stop them from murdering his own vassals, something which eventually manifested itself when the Alessian Order committed a coup in the Imperial City and took full power over the Alessian Empire. Lelorion Dwemer, now king of Nanalata, had managed to mostly stay out of the conflict and even saw Nanalata's might having increased due to the many refugees from purged Ayleid cities all having come to Nanalata to find refuge and eventually strengthen the numbers of that kingdom. Now, Lelorion Dwemer, having always had a good relationship with the ruling emperor and standing as a neutral vassal power in Cyrodiil, swore fealty to the new regime of the Alessian Order, hoping to once more keep his kingdom out of the shade. And for a time this worked. Nanalata survived and to an extent even flourished for 40 more years under the Alessian Order. However, around them, the Alessian Order now officially held state-induced pogroms against the Ayleid city-states which remained. King Lelorion's diplomacy managed to keep Nanalata out of trouble, but one by one all the other Ayleid vassal states fell until eventually Nanalata stood alone, as the sole remaining Ayleid kingdom in Cyrodiil, and it's even suggested that at that point it was the very last kingdom of the Ayleids which remained, period. Although there are suggestions that there were more enclaves out of the Alessian Order's reach which had survived up until then, like in Blackmarsh where we have some ruins from this period. But in Cyrodiil, Nanalata stood alone, and in the year 372 of the First Era, the fateful day finally came when a messenger arrived from the Emperor for King Lelorion. You see, the messenger provided an ultimatum for the last Ayleid kingdom of Cyrodiil. Leave the Empire, take your people, and leave our borders or face annihilation like the other kingdoms. The Alessian Order wanted all Ayleids out of their borders, and King Lelorion, knowing that he could not prevail when all legions of the Empire would be on Nanalata, decided to take his people on an exodus out of the Alessian Order's reach, and en masse, the last Ayleid people of Cyrodiil made ready to leave for High Rock, where they hoped to find a safe haven where the Alessian Order would not be able to drive them out. There were those who protested, who wished to stay behind and defend Nanalata, but as those who decided to move on would soon learn, those who stayed behind got slaughtered as the Alessian Order released their full might on them and fed their corpses to local goblins. King Lelorion led his loyal people out of Cyrodiil towards High Rock. On the way it said that the king himself rode his loyal Sanchez, Sidar, And it said that every day he himself joined the hunters which separated from the Exodus group of refugees to find food to feed the lost population of Nanalata. Now, eventually they arrived in High Rock, where they found an ally in the High Elves of the Clan Dereni. I also made a video on them, so be sure to check it out if you want to know more about Clan Dereni. Now, in High Rock they drove out the orcs from this island on Lake Halcyon, and under King Lelorian they built a new Ayleid kingdom named Bisnensel, which means New Water Halls. Here the Ayleids found a new home, which they modeled after their lost home of Nanalata. The Bretons of the region tolerated them, and they underheld good relations with the Dereni elves who were their allies, but even this period of restoration would not last long, as within the city of Bisnensel the differences among the Ayleids living there ended up tearing its population apart. An Ayleid priest of the city by the name of Uluskan started a cult which worshipped Hermaeus Mora, the Daedra Prince of Knowledge. This cult started to gain traction among the population of the city and ended up becoming so powerful and influential that soon their leader, that priest Uluskan, demanded that King Lelorian ceded parts of his power to him. The king decided not to surrender to this Daedra cult and refused their request, but then a few months later the priest and his followers undertook a coup and deposed the king. The king, his family and their most loyal followers, who would not bow to the Daedra cultists, were then forced to leave the city and then fled to the capital of the Dereni clan's holdings, the Isle of Balfira. There Clan Dereni granted amnesty to King Dinar, who would work with them and become one of their most powerful generals. For about 20 years he was then one of Clan Dereni's most powerful generals, fighting with them and leading their troops in wars against Skyrim and eventually also against the imperial troops of the Alessian Order, which ended up fighting their way towards High Rock, hoping to subjugate the province to the Alessian Empire. He fought many battles against the Alessians as they attempted to wrest High Rock from the Dereni elves, but ultimately the Alessians failed when they were defeated at the Battle of Glanumbra Moors, where the Dereni, with King Dinar's help and allies from all over the north, managed to decisively defeat the Alessian Order's troops and drive them back to Cyrodiil, their power broken. As the Dereni troops chased the retreating Alessians, the king likely came across Bisnensel once again, only to find it in ruin after the Alessians burned it to the ground in their hatred for the elves during their advance towards High Rock. All that now remained of his people was he himself, his family and a few loyal followers. They travelled with the Dereni armies as they fought the Alessian horde back into Cyrodiil, and eventually they entered the Heartland. There he and the few elves that he had left came upon the ancient ruins of their home of Nanalata after splitting off from the main army. Their ancient home was completely in ruin, with the corpses of their family and friends who refused to leave the city still there, as their bones were being gnawed on by the goblins that the Alessians left in the ruins. They did not resettle in this place of death and instead started to wander across the face of Tamriel, where he and his followers would eventually find themselves in a holy city somewhere in Cyrodiil, which was dedicated to the worship of Morgiah, the Daedra Prince of Light. Here he stayed for a while, and while he stayed in the city with his followers, the Daedra Prince Molag Bal, Meridia's Daedric rival, invaded the city with his minions. King Dinar took control of the defenses of the city and valiantly defended it. According to legend, he even defended a gate all by himself against the minions of Molag Bal for quite some time. But then Molag Bal opened a grand portal designed to suck the city into Cold Harbor, his realm of Oblivion. Morgiah then protected the city with a strong ward, but the city was still being sucked into Cold Harbor, along with King Dinar and the few remaining elves that were with him. The city, while in Cold Harbor, would serve as a protected environment with Morgiah's ward still active, but over the years its population died out, and eventually King Dinar, now having converted to the worship of Morgiah, was captured by the minions of Molag Bal and imprisoned in his realm, ready to be tortured for the next few thousand years. More than 2,000 years then passed, King Dinar remaining locked up in Cold Harbor. What few remnants of Ayleid civilization remained on Tamriel slowly died out, until it's likely that by the year 582 of the Second Era, he truly was the last living Ayleid. Although he wasn't on Tamriel, he was being locked up in Cold Harbor. For more than 2,000 years he'd been imprisoned in a cold, dark tower, regularly tortured. Now the only thing he could do in that tower is pray to Morgiah for eventual release and write his memoirs when he could somehow get hold of a piece of parchment. His light had nearly faded when the Vestige, the main character of the Elder Scrolls Online, along with an invasion force of Mages Guild and Fighters Guild troops, entered Cold Harbor on a mission to stop Molag Bal's scheme of merging Cold Harbor with the Mortal Plane. The Vestige then freed the Ayleid king, who joined the fight against the Daedra Prince of Schemes, commanding the troops of the Fighters Guild as they had lost their leader in the invasion. The Lost Ayleid King then fights with the player until the very end. He helps close the planar vortex, which is sucking Tamriel into Oblivion, and ends up giving his life for the cause, as in the final fight he is mortally wounded. His final moments are spent in Meridia's holy city, where in her cathedral he speaks his last words. My time has finally come, it seems. I have lived far longer than any of my people. Finally I will be able to join them once more. My fate doesn't matter. I'm gladdened by the thought that Nirn is safe. I shall rest well knowing that my final day, the final day of the Ayleid people, was spent saving Nirn from the clutches of Molag Bal. I've seen the rise and fall of my people, yet I stand before you, the last of my kind. I am the last Ayleid. I stood alongside the younger races, I aided them, and I believed in what they fought for. But I'm proud to call you my friend. That ends the story of the Lost Ayleid, born in the twilight of their people, their last leader, a king in dark times. Now, his story is one filled with betrayal and suffering, but also courage and unending fighting spirit. His death speaks the final sentence in the story of his kind and closes the history books on them forever. In the end, mortals would fight over his crown during the time of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, where there's a quest to fetch the crown of the king of Nanalata almost 800 years after his demise in Cold Harbor. That is the last piece of his legacy that we know about, and truly ends the story of this video. And that's about all I can say about the Lost Ayleid King. Now next up, let's talk about Sotha. Well, not Sotha himself, that guy is a celebrity and as a living god has hogged the spotlight on YouTube often enough. No, let's talk about his far lesser known family member, Sotha Nall, his sister, whose story is quite tragic and creepy to say the least. The living god Sotha was born somewhere in the early First Era, when the Dwemer or Dark Elves did not yet have their ashen skin and were still the gold-skinned Chimer. He was born in the town of Alt Sotha, a town belonging to the minor Chimery house of Sotha. House Sotha was small in almost every aspect, unimportant and not having been part of any great deeds whatsoever, only really ruling the town. Sotha was born, as far as we know, as the youngest and only son of the ruling family of the town, and in extension, as the only and youngest son of House Sotha. We know that at this time he had a living mother, sister and a nanny that took care of him. There is no information on the names of the mother or the nanny, nor is there any information on the fate of his father. The only thing that we do have some information on is his sister, Sotha Nall. Sotha Nall was someone who we know that the child Sotha very much looked up to and adored in many ways. As children they were apparently good friends and cared for each other, as his sister would often sing him lullabies and they would often do things together, like walk together in the flower gardens, skipping stones on the fish pond, catch torch bugs. As they got older, however, Sotha remained very strict and very afraid of the consequences of his actions, while his sister became a bit rebellious to the family. From the dialogue that we get from her in Sotha memory bank, we learn that Sotha sister would sometimes invite him to do things against his mother and Neddy's wishes, saying things to Sotha like this: "You're overthinking this. We sneak out, we sneak back in, no one will ever be the wiser. What are you afraid of? Nanny finding out? You're an adult now. No one will ever realize that we are missing. Besides, what's the worst mother can do? A scolding?" We don't know what thing they were going to do in this specific instance, but it does give some insight into their later conflicting personalities when an older sister became slightly rebellious to their family, while Seal tried to stick to the rules. Unfortunately, their siblingship would soon come to an end, as while Sotha was still young, long before his glory days as a living god, on a rainy day, the town Alt Sotha was attacked by the forces of Mehrunes Dagon, who burned the entire town to the ground and killed all its inhabitants, completely wiping out House Sotha, save for Sotha, who was saved from the town's rubble by his later friend and fellow tribune, Vivek. We don't know why Mehrunes Dagon attacked the town. There's a lore book of an apostle of Sotha trying to find out Sotha's origins and his childhood, but he didn't really find anything on why Alt Sotha was destroyed by Dagon or why entire House Sotha was wiped out. He does speculate that Sotha himself might know a bit more about the matter, but simply didn't mind to reveal it. Why that is only up for speculation. On the internet, some have speculated that the destruction of the town was linked to Sotha and Sotha Nall sneaking out against their mother's wishes, and that their rebellious acts somehow caused the attack, because Sotha has been remarkably silent on the entire matter ever since he was rescued by Vivek. But there's no real evidence for that, so do with that speculation as you wish. Some also believe that it might have been linked to Sotha's future divinity and that Mehrunes Dagon learned of that and tried to take him out before them. But there's no real evidence for either of the theories, so I personally don't really believe either. I think there might be some other solution, but both theories are viable, I just don't see any evidence. Now, the history of Sotha Nall, his sister, doesn't quite end there, as while she is deceased at this point, Sotha still very much mourned her loss, far more than any other death of the town, including his mother and nanny. Years later, after basically becoming a living god after the Battle of Red Mountain, Azura's Curse and the creation of the Clockwork City itself, Sotha was still mourning her loss, as Sotha crafted a special memento to her, an alargic replication or a projection of her, at his private little garden. Under the projection, which we can find in Elder Scrolls Online, there's a plaque saying the following. Sotha Nall, a soul that deserved transcendence, may her song be heard in the hiss of every piston and the sigh of every spring. This indicates that even after becoming a living god, the infallible Sotha still mourned his sister greatly and sought for ways to preserve her memory, like this projection. But that is not the only way that she was preserved in the Clockwork City, at least not speculatively. It's heavily hinted at in the game that the factotums, which are Sotha many robots that patrol the Clockwork City and basically maintain it, that they carry her voice, that the voice that we hear coming from them are hers. And perhaps even more of her is in these factotums, as in-game scholars have speculated that perhaps part of her soul is actually used in the creation of the personalities of these factotums. This is first hinted at in the lore book The Factotum's Secret Voice, where the apostle lector Tirdas Dran wishes to find out who the voice of the factotums is, after many outsiders have asked him, whose voice is that, after the outsiders first enter the Clockwork City. He finds that on his quest there is some serious pushback, as people don't really know and feel like it's blasphemous territory to try and find out the works behind Sotha own creations, as the factotums, tinkering with them is kind of taboo in the Clockwork City. But ultimately he finds it most likely that the voice belonged to Sotha sister, Sotha Nall, as he cared for her preservation most, and in his memory bank one can find a memory of Sotha working on early factotums, saying to himself the following. Factotums, they will need a voice, something consistent but easily replicable, perhaps something comforting. In addition to that, the factotums sometimes produce strange sentences, likely composed out of the memories of the soul that drives them, saying things like burning beds, screaming, and collapsed roof, crushed child. Sentences which likely derive from the last memories of the soul in the factotums, memories of Mehrunes Dagon's attack and the fall of Old Sotha. He also says that whenever these type of sentences come out of the factotums, they immediately go out to the disassembly line to get either destroyed or reset, which is kind of creepy in a way, but still a very interesting piece of lore, at least to me, as it heavily indicates that Sotha used the soul, or at least part of the soul, of his sister to power these factotums in order to have some sort of memory of her. And that is kinda creepy, but you can't say that that doesn't make his sister's tale a story worth telling. Now, someone else whose story is worth telling in my opinion is that of the last living Dwemer, Yagrum Bagarn, the only one of his race, as far as we know, to have survived their demise in the First Era, and the only living Dwemer that we can meet in any of the games. Also, I was suffering from a severe cold when this was recorded, so prepare for a weird voice.
Sotha once said, "You wonder where the Dwemer have gone? Perhaps it's better to wonder why one remains." This quote most likely refers to Yagrum Bagarn, the last known living Dwemer. He's the only one to have survived the extinction of the race and is still sort of functional in Tamriel. His story begins back in the First Era, when the Dwemer were still flourishing and advancing their technology. We don't know much about his early life, but we do know that he ended up as one of the master crafters in the service of Kargranek, the greatest tonal architect and scientist of the Dwemer at the time. Kargranek and tonal architecture are a whole story on themselves, but in short, Kargranek was the guy who led the effort of the Dwemer in their search for immortality for their race. He was the one to try and discern the secrets of immortality by working the heart of Lorkhan, and our pal Yagrum Bagarn was one of his underlings, who executed Kargranek's designs. According to his own words, Yagrum considers himself to be quite clever, but the genius of Kargranek was on a whole other level than that of himself, and that of the other mastercrafters under his regime. He was truly the greatest enchanter of his time. Kargranek would envision something and explain it to his mastercrafters, and they would create it for him. Like that, Yagrum would help Kargranek create many of his designs. We don't know exactly what projects Yagrum helped with, but we can assume there were more projects than just working the heart of Lorkhan, because we know that he didn't work on that project specifically, but that he worked on other projects of Kargranek's. because Yagrum never saw their tools used, because somewhere before the work on the tools of the heart were completed, Yagrum got stuck in some unknown outer realm, most likely in an Oblivion realm, for several years. We can assume that him being stuck in that realm had something to do with his job, most likely something went wrong during an experiment of sorts, or maybe it was part of an experiment. This sort of curse of being in an outer realm, isolated from Tamriel, would however turn out to be sort of a blessing in disguise, as while he was stuck there, Kargerneck attempted to use the tools to work on the heart of Lorkhan. Unfortunately, after Kargerneck worked the heart, the Dwemer race disappeared altogether, except for Yagrum, because Yagrum wasn't on Tamriel at the time. He says that at some point when he was able to escape this realm and return to Tamriel, he found his own race gone, and he found that he was the only one left. He says he wandered Tamriel for years in hopes of finding survivors. He travelled all the way to the known faraway colonies like Volenfell in current-day Hammerfell, only to find their cities there deserted. Even those Dwemer far away from Red Mountain during the execution of the tools on the heart had disappeared. He kept searching for years for a survivor or someone with an explanation, but he didn't find anything, and at some point he gave up searching, and he decided to venture back to Red Mountain to see whether he could see what happened there to his race on the moment of their disappearance. But instead of finding answers, he only found Dagoth Ur's 6th house and contracted corpus disease. The corpus disease misformed him, making his body grotesque and his limbs rotten, and it took much of his sanity until he was a mere rambling mess, essentially suffering from very bad dementia. He describes this phase of his life as being a mad monster out of his own mind, and that he was in this state for several years until he was found by the Telvanni wizard Devaith Fear, a powerful wizard who researched corpus disease, and who recognized Yagrum to be a Dwemer and took high interest. The Telvanni wizard then tested many spells on him until he managed to cure Yagrum of most of his dementia, making him sane again for most of the time. In addition to that, he helped Yagrum enchant the lower half of a dwarven spider to serve as a replacement for his legs, as his legs had rotten away due to the corpus disease. This way he could live and function again, sort of, but he himself says that he will never be back on the level of craftsmanship he was before contracting corpus, because both his hands and eyes have deteriorated badly due to the corpus, and that his existence is kind of bleak, since even though the dwarven spider provides him with some form of transportation, it's far from ideal. But even then, he can now still fix some of the most basic Dwemer objects you hand him, being a master craftsman by trade, being one of the few on Tamriel who can actually do that. He and Devaith Fear became friends of sorts, although Devaith apparently only sees the dwarf as more of an addition to his collection who can fix all dwarven relics for him. However, because of his friendship status, Yagrum has a bit more comfort than the other corpus victims in the Corpusarium, and said that he and the wizard have had long conversations on history and that they exchange and shape theories on the Dwemer's disappearance. Despite the long years of theorizing, however, Yagrum has not yet found a definitive reason for the Dwemer's disappearance. He says that he thinks that the tools of Kargerneck and his attempt to work the heart on Lorkhan with metapoetic forces is most likely the cause. He says that even back in his day there were some logicians among the Dwemer who doubted that working the heart of Lorkhan to give the Dwemer the race divine powers would work or would be safe, and that they predicted that it could have unforeseen circumstances. Yagrum says that most likely those logicians were right, and that next to giving immortality to their race has most likely been transported to some sort of outer realm as an unforeseen course or consequence, or just erased from existence altogether. And that, ironically, Kargerneck, who wanted to give their race immortality, might just have utterly destroyed their race. Yagrum was in the Compulsarium in the care of Devaith Fear for a long time. He used his time quite well, actually, by helping with Dwemer research, and in addition to that he also wrote the book Tamrielic Lore, which you can find in Morrowind, Oblivion and the Elder Scrolls Online. In the book he accounts of many legendary artifacts around Tamriel, including some Daedric artifacts that he has heard of during his long life, and describes them best he can. But his existence in the Corpusarium in the care of Devaith Fear was a pretty lonely existence, not really having much intelligent company except for Lord Fear himself when he would visit. That only changed late in the Third Era when he could be visited by the Nerevarine, the player of the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. There Yagrum can help the player several times during his quest, especially with the ancient artifacts to use on the heart of Lorkhan. Yagrum is also one of the few in Morrowind who can translate Dwemer texts, and the only person in Morrowind who can tell you what the books Divine Metaphysics and Egg of Time are about. To the other translators, these books are simply the sort of writings of a madman, but Yagrum explains that divine metaphysics is an advanced explanation of Kargrenek's theories, and that he could explain them to the player, but that he won't, because he thinks that Kargrenek is dead and believes that his theory should die with him. Egg of Time, he says, is a book that explains how the working of the heart of Lorkhan should have no disastrous effects, contrary to what some of the logicians said, but something that seems to be false, since the entire Dwemer race has disappeared after the working on the heart. In the end, it's unknown what happened to Yagrum. The Reverend was successfully cured of the bad aspects of corpus disease, so perhaps Yagrum got the same treatment and got cured, helping Lord Fear with his research for several years more, but we have no idea. In addition to that, we don't even know whether he survived the Red Year and the eruption of the Red Mountain that destroyed Vvardenfell. It can be speculated that if the Devate Fear survived, Yagrum would also have survived, since the Devate would not have let the last, living Dwemer die. But in the end, we simply don't know. We have reason to expect that Lord Fear for himself survived, as we can find one of his daughters of sorts in the Elder Scrolls Legends in the 4th era, meaning that he himself might have survived the Red Year too, and thus Yagrum might have survived too. But unfortunately, we have simply no solid conclusions on that one.
Anyway, whether or not he survived is a question for later games to answer, but now let's talk about someone who we definitely know is dead by now. The notorious First Era Emperor, Emperor Brazollus Dor, whom I nicknamed Tamriel's Party Emperor, because he cared very little for ruling and much more about partying. So, the Riemann Empire, or the Second Cyrodiilic Empire. At its height it spanned across almost all of Tamriel and would be the biggest empire Tamriel had ever seen until Tiber Septim would conquer the entire continent at the end of the Second Era for the Septim Empire. Now, the Riemann Empire's history can be split into two distinct chapters. First, the reign of the 5 Riemann Emperors, and then, after the assassination of the final Riemann Emperor and all his heirs, the rule of the Ekaviri potentates, who were once advisors to the emperors, but once there were no legitimate heirs left, they took full control of the empire at the start of the Second Era. Now, it's important to know that each of the Riemann Emperors had a trusted Ekaviri advisor potentate, ever since the invading forces of Ekavir, who were looking for a Dragonborn on Tamriel during the First Era, had encountered Riemann Cyrodiil, who would later become the first of the Riemann Emperors, and crucially, he was a Dragonborn. Because when they heard his voice, they joined his forces instead of continuing their military campaign on Tamriel, as the Ekaviri had now found their Dragonborn. From that moment on, each Riemann Emperor would have an Ekaviri advisor, and so did the emperor that we're talking about today, Brazollus Dor, who ruled the Riemann Empire for 34 years, serving as its 4th emperor after the death of his father, Emperor Riemann II. And by the way, in case you hadn't noticed, the image that I'm using for Brazollus Dor is not Brazollus Dor, as we don't know what he looks like, so I just used an image of Emperor Uriel Septim VII with a party hat and sunglasses, because that really fits, as you'll see. Deal with it. Now, the way he ascended to the throne was quite curious, because Emperor Brazollus Dor was never supposed to be an emperor. In fact, he was the illegitimate son of Emperor Riemann II and a common-born maid named Irina Dor, who the former emperor slept with while staying in the city of Skingrad. Now, for their son, Brazollus, there wasn't really all that much hope at his birth of ever for him to reach the throne. However, his fate was a lot better than many of the other bastard sons across Tamriel, as Emperor Riemann II was quite fond of his mother. Even though politically he could never be with her, he at least made sure that she was set up in a comfortable mansion with ample servants, and made sure that their son would get a proper education and could also live at the mansion. And as such, Brazollus Dor grew up into a smart and handsome young man, reportedly resembling his father greatly in all aspects, except for one. Because Brazollus Dor was extremely unambitious and quite lazy, growing up mostly just partying, tending to his vineyard and hunting with his friends. And this would have been his life, were it not that Emperor Riemann II died while trying to conquer Morrowind, leaving no other heirs. So, since Brazollus Dor was a Dragonborn, he was called up for the throne. Since he was officially a bastard, he did keep his mother's name Dor in the histories. Instead of being renamed to Brazollus Riemann, he was still called Brazollus Dor. And it's said that he took on the responsibilities of the throne with a heavy heart. And in the first few years of his reign, he tried to at least pretend like he cared about ruling, probably more out of a sense of obligation than anything else, as he tried to continue his father's conquest of Morrowind, in which he did reportedly fought quite valiantly, and he tried to be in the White Gold Tower to do administrative work, but especially these administrative duties really didn't interest him, nor was he very suited to deal with them, so he left most of his duties to his Ekaviri potentate advisor, Sidri Ashak. While the Emperor himself would often be gone long from court, returning only sparingly, Sidri Ashak basically ran the Empire until the Emperor returned, and that is until he had a large luxurious villa built for himself in the Cyrodiilic countryside that he called Villa Doria. At that point, Emperor Brazollus was straight up never in the court anymore and rather concerned himself with the things he liked doing, and with that I mean the aforementioned eating, drinking, playing games, hunting and debauched pleasures of the flesh with women, often in group settings, in a word that I can't say due to demonetization. You know which word I mean. And while his Akaviri potentate in the background just quietly ran the empire from the imperial city, this is what the emperor did. Now, Emperor Brazollus kinda reminds me of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, who also was away for long stretches from Rome, instead being on his island of Capri, leaving a confidant in Rome to assume many of his duties, although I don't remember him being as disinterested in ruling as Brazollus, but hey, I'm not a Rome expert, so I may have missed that part in the histories. Now, while at his villa, Brazollus had the greatest of times. He wooed many a woman, held extravagant feasts of more than 40 dishes for every attendee. He slept with Argonian courtesans, apparently ate a lot of beaver tails. He ruined political relations with elsewhere by culturally offending a Khajiit diplomat. He played jokes with his guests, made fun of his brother-in-law for losing his balls, and slept with the wife of one of his ministers. You know, emperor stuff. Now, Brazollus' story actually ends quite abruptly here, as one day he simply died unexpectedly in his villa. He'd been aging, but he had still been very healthy, which had led some historians to believe that the emperor was assassinated internally by those who felt like the Akaviri potentate was getting a little bit too much power, and that faction perhaps wanted his son, who was now almost of age, on the throne instead, as he was far more ambitious than his father had ever been. Now, despite all of Brazollus' flaws, most peasants from his time actually look back upon his reign with fondness, because under his rule, kind of just nothing happened. The empire was prosperous and no catastrophic things were attempted, like ill-found invasions or trade wars or something like that, which crashed the economy. The empire was just peaceful. It was a good time for the average citizen of the empire. So, you know, despite his flaws, I don't think Brazollus was all that bad of a ruler. I mean, yeah, he kinda abused his own power for personal gains and did nothing for the empire, but considering all the histories tell us that he was quite incompetent, and the fact that he needed to be emperor due to the dragon blood he possessed and didn't really have a choice himself anyway, him then recognizing, hey, I don't want to rule, I'm bad at it, I'm going to my villa, and you, more capable potentate, you rule the empire without doing anything crazy. That worked out quite well for most people on Tamriel, and it's not like he just left any random guy in charge, as his potentate, Sidri Ashak, is remembered by many vassals of the time as being a very capable ruler and someone of integrity. The potentate's memoirs are still even studied by rulers hundreds of years later, so I mean, leaving him in charge really wasn't a bad decision. Alright, that's about all I can say about Emperor Brazollus. Quite a fun and interesting story. So now let's ruin the mood again by talking about a tragic story. The story of two quite interesting individuals. A disillusioned Dark Brotherhood assassin who turned on her own faction, and the highly ambitious primate of Akator's worship, Artorius Ponticus. Two people central to the Elder Scrolls Online's Dark Brotherhood questline, and two people whose stories are so interwoven that we need to talk about them both at the same time. Now, we have to recount both their stories until their paths cross for you to fully understand the dynamics between these two people and why these two people nearly destroyed the Western Cyrodiil chapter for the Dark Brotherhood and took over the political power in the region. So, let's start with Lyra Viria. Lyra was a female imperial born in the middle of the Second Era, likely somewhere near Leowin. Details of her early life are practically non-existent, but we do know that at a relatively young age, she found herself being recruited by the Dark Brotherhood. She would become one of their assassins, and a really skillful one at that. And over the years she completed many contracts and eventually found herself based in a Brotherhood sanctuary somewhere in western Blackmarsh. There she fit right into the family. In that sanctuary she had friends, a sense of camaraderie and familiar relationships. She felt at home, and it was a good life for a professional murderer, of course. And it wasn't long until she had attained the rank of Silencer, a personal assassin for one of the speakers of the Black Hand, the Brotherhood's leadership. It was a successful life, but before we can continue her story, we now have to take a look at our second protagonist, Artorius Ponticus. His youth was very different from Lyra's. He grew up pampered in a rich family in Cyrodiil, and he was the youngest son of the house. And unlike his older brothers, he didn't really have a direction in his life. While his brothers went into the family business and started careers, he had a very directionless life, and at some point he was suggested by his family that perhaps, just as the youngest children of many rich families did, he should dedicate his life to the worship of the gods. Now, he disdained this idea, and he started wandering the streets of the imperial city looking for purpose. This eventually led him to a life of crime, running odd jobs for the underworld. To him, this was a life of excitement and adventure, and he felt like he had a purpose. But it didn't take long for him to get arrested. Now, while generally his actions should have been punished by severe prison time or perhaps even death, his father's influence and wealth persuaded the captain of the guard to give Artorius a different punishment. Rather than prison time, he would spend a year with the priests of the Temple of the Divines in Wayrest, then part of the Longhouse Empire, where the priests would set him straight. There he mainly had to do chores and daily worship, studying scripture, that kind of thing. While at first he disliked this life, it's said that he eventually took a liking to the scriptures of Akatosh and got a particular affinity with the dragon god of time. This became so clear that when the then primate of the Akatosh Cathedral in Khajiit, a man named Jonas Coventine, came to visit the temple in Wayrest, he managed to convince the young Artorius to pledge the rest of his life, after his year of mandatory service, to the worship of Akatosh. Now, as a priest of Akatosh, Artorius wanted nothing more than to serve in the Cathedral of Akatosh in Khajiit, the Tamrielic center of Akatosh worship. But in order to serve there, one must be invited by the primate. Luckily for him, something quite miraculous happened, which put him right on the primate's radar and gave him an invite to come serve at the cathedral eventually. It was called the Miracle of the First Shrine. Now, a disclaimer. We get this story from sources all written after Artorius' ascension to the highest office in the Temple of Akatosh, so this may be partially or fully propaganda. Especially since we know that from the moment that his priesthood started, he did everything he could to get favor with the higher placed priests, so he could try and weasel himself into higher positions in the clergy. So whether or not this story is true, well, I'll leave it to you. Okay, so the story goes that one day a man brought his dead son to the Temple of Akatosh. Artorius was serving there at the time, and the child was dead, impaled by an arrow, so dead. But Artorius placed him on a shrine, and then Artorius prayed to Akatosh for 3 whole days straight, until he suddenly began talking in a strange language, and the shrine began to be enveloped in a mysterious light, which through Artorius reached the dead boy, which was then once more alive, and the arrow which had impaled the kid was gone. He was alive after multiple days of being dead. Now people call that the Miracle of Akatosh. Now whether it all happened exactly this way or was, perhaps staged by Artorius to get power, I'll leave that to you. All I'm saying is that considering his later life methods, faking something like this would not be completely out of character. Now, whether or not the story was fake, a miracle-performing priest is the kind of priest that the Akatosh clergy would want to, serve at the great cathedral in Khajiit. So it didn't really take long for Primate Jonas Coventine to invite Artorius to the great cathedral, where the two apparently had a quite close relationship, as Primate Jonas took Artorius under his personal tutelage, and Artorius, as a result, rose quite quickly through the church's ranks, until after a few years he was the undisputed number 2, only behind the primate himself in the clergy ranks. But once he had reached this number 2 status, it didn't take long for friction to start between Primate Jonas Coventine and Artorius, as Artorius advocated for the Temple of Akatosh and his clergy to expand its political power in the empire, while Jonas wanted the Temple of Akatosh to continue focus itself on purely religious matters. How this got resolved? Well, we need some background story for that. Specifically, it's time to bring our other protagonist of the story back into the fold, Lyra Viria, the Dark Brotherhood Silencer. Because right around the time of the disagreement between Primate Coventine and Artorius, Lyra got a bone-chilling new assignment. Her speaker informed her that the Brotherhood sanctuary that she had served in had been picked for purification. Now, purification, for those who haven't played Oblivion's Dark Brotherhood questline, means that the Black Hand suspects that there's an infiltrator among the Dark Brotherhood's ranks, and instead of trying to find out who it is, the Black Hand selects a silencer, someone who can act outside the bounds of the Brotherhood tenets, of not killing other members of the Brotherhood, to kill everyone in a sanctuary, essentially using a blindfold and a shotgun in hopes of also taking out the traitor. Lyra, as silencer, was chosen for this crude method, and she was then tasked to take out everyone in her sanctuary by Sithis' will. Now remember, these were her only family and friends that she had known for well over a decade now, and she was supposed to wipe them all out. But, as a faithful assassin, she did carry out the assignment. She murdered everyone in the sanctuary, everyone she knew and loved, all in the name of Sithis and the Dark Brotherhood. She did it all with a heavy heart, and by the end, when all had been slain but her, she apparently wept and she felt broken and lost. But there's no room for mortal feelings in the life of a Dark Brotherhood silencer, as mere moments after she had just killed everyone she loved, her speaker entered the sanctuary and told her to move on to the next assignment. She wanted to refuse and asked the speaker for time to grieve over her family, but the speaker scolded her, calling her his tool, a simple weapon that ought not feel emotions. She then solemnly accepted the new contract, the contract on Primate Coventine's head. Because, you see, as Lyra had purged her sanctuary, Artorius, in a play for power over the Temple of Akatosh, performed the Black Sacrament and used it to set the Dark Brotherhood on his mentor. However, instead of just letting Lyra kill Primate Coventine, Artorius awaited her before she carried out the deed, either because he wanted to see what assassin the Dark Brotherhood would send, or through some other motive. However, when he noticed how troubled Lyra was, distracted, still grieving over the friend she had to murder, he altered the game. He talked to her and tried to convince her that through Akatosh and Akatosh alone she could gain redemption for her weighty conscience. She didn't believe him at first, arguing that for a vile murderer like herself there was no redemption, signaling how she had become completely disillusioned with the Brotherhood at this point. However, he would manage to convince her in the end, arguing that Akatosh performs miracles all the time and through her talent for murder, she could help carry out the Dragon God's will, which then in turn could save her soul from the Void and Sithis, arguing that her soul could yet be saved if she would become his champion, a sword for Akatosh, the Black Dragon that would burn away evil's darkness. Through Lyra's desperation and guilt, she agreed, seeing a chance for redemption and divine forgiveness for her sins. She became the first Blade of the Order of the Hour, an anonymous warrior going by the nickname the Black Dragon, donning a black-trimmed warrior armor with full helm adorned in Akatosh heraldry. Her first act was to silently kill Primate Coventine, her original contract, and then fake her death as a Brotherhood assassin so she could return as the mysterious anonymous First Sword of the Order. Primate Artorius then became somewhat of a mentor to her, and the two actually became closer as Lyra got indoctrinated into the Akatosh cult and faithfully carried out her new master's bidding, who had now officially become Primate, killing those who stood in his way with Lyra's talents to enlarge his power in the Akatosh clergy. This arrangement of the Primate and the First Sword functioned for a few years as Artorius strengthened his grip on the clergy and the militant Order of the Hour, that also served him. And then the dream of any power-hungry leader of a church and militant group came true. The Empire fell, and the Emperor Varen Aquilarius disappeared, and the forces of Molag Bal invaded Tamriel. The continent descended into absolute chaos as the three great alliances in the Daggerfall Covenant, Altmeri Dominion and the Ebonheart Pact invaded Cyrodiil, and everything just went to absolute crap. You can see that story in my recap of the Elder Scrolls Online's main questline, which is in the description of this video. However, this chaos on Tamriel is just what's important for this video, as it meant that without a central government to keep everyone in check, Primate Artorius was able to make his power even greater. However, there were two obstacles to that. Khajiit, the city of the cathedral his order is located in, was still ruled by Count Carolus Aquilarius, the nephew of the late Emperor Varen, and crucially a man with a conscience who doesn't like taking underhanded measures. And second, there was the obstacle of pirate queen and self-proclaimed governor of the nearby city of Anvil, Fortunata Abdugul, who was looking to potentially conquer Khajiit with her pirates after having conquered Anvil, and if she did, that would be the end of Artorius' attempt of gaining more power, since Fortunata wasn't particularly keen on sharing power with a church. For the full story on how Fortunata came to power, by the way, check out my video on her, which is also in the description. Anyway, when the Empire fell, the situation on the Gold Coast had become quite complicated. You see, when the Empire fell, Fortunata Abdugul tried to force Count Carolus Aquilarius to join forces with her to quote-unquote preserve the Gold Coast's independence against the three great alliances. Very reluctantly, Count Carolus agreed, as at that moment, without any imperial reinforcements from Cyrodiil, he stood very little chance against Fortunata's pirates if they were ever to invade Khajiit. So, as he agreed to Fortunata's quote-unquote alliance, and she ready to send some of her troops to Khajiit to quote-unquote reinforce it, see, conquer it, Count Carolus went to the only one that he could to go for help. Primate Artorius. He asked the Primate, despite his knowledge that this would probably be a very bad idea, whether the Order of the Hour, the militant order of the Temple of Akatosh, could reinforce the city guard so that they would have the numbers to together maybe repel a possible pirate attack by Fortunata, and stop the troops that Fortunata sent to their gates. Artorius, seeing an opportunity to enlarge his own power, obviously agreed to this and quickly started expanding the Order of the Hour and the responsibilities of the Order to a far greater level than what Count Carolus had asked for. Essentially officially starting a power struggle over the authority in Khajiit with Count Carolus, trying to marginalize the Count as much as possible. So now we have a power struggle over Khajiit between Count Carolus and Primate Artorius, and a power struggle over the Greater Gold Coast between the two of them and the Pirate Queen, Fortunata Abdougal, who rules Anvil. For some time they basically kept stabbing each other in the dark, trying to increase their power while putting up fake smiles and cooperating quote unquote with each other publicly, having very tense public relations. But the power struggle quickly turned dark as Fortunata Abdougal started to use the Black Sacrament and the Dark Brotherhood assassins to kill the other's underlings to intimidate the Count and the Primate. This was scary for Primate Artorius as he knew the power of the Dark Brotherhood. After all, he's used them to kill his former master, and thus knew that this could very quickly spill out of hand, as it likely wouldn't be long until either Fortunata or maybe Carolus would get the idea to use the Brotherhood to kill him off. So, he then decided that the Dark Brotherhood would be too much of a wild card to leave alive in the area, as their involvement in the conflict was just too much of a risk. So he then ordered the Black Dragon, Lyra Viria, to hunt down the local Brotherhood, kill their members and locate their sanctuary to burn it to the ground. So Lyra went to work, tracking down Dark Brotherhood members, capturing them after they made their kills, so she and Artorius could interrogate them about the location of their sanctuary and then kill them. While at the same time Primate Artorius exposed the murders in Khajiit that the Brotherhood undertook and put a spotlight on them as a way to make the people feel unsafe in Khajiit and thus expand the power of the Order of the Hour at the expense of Count Carolus. Unfortunately, none of the Brotherhood members would speak on the location of their sanctuary, so no matter how many assassins Lyra killed and tortured, they could not find out the location of the Brotherhood sanctuary. And this is around the time when we as the player join the Dark Brotherhood in the Elder Scrolls Online's Dark Brotherhood questline. That questline is in large part dominated by the Order of the Hour trying to clamp down on the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood trying to find out who the Black Dragon is, who has been killing so many of their members so that they can instead kill her. But that doesn't quite pan out the way the Brotherhood wants, as several of its members get killed during the investigations, and even worse, the Dark Brotherhood would soon be used for more than just killing underlings in the Great Gold Coast power struggle, because as the player you can witness that the goody two-shoes Count Carolus Aquilarius, the one who hadn't really used the Brotherhood or underhanded tactics yet, has been driven to such desperation, feeling Fortunata and Artorius closing in on him, that he wanted to use the Dark Brotherhood to assassinate Fortunata Abdougal, as he saw her as the biggest threat of the two. The Brotherhood took this contract, and you and a fellow Brotherhood assassin killed the pirate governor successfully. However, this crossed a pretty big line. The assassination of Fortunata made it so that Primate Artorius had the Black Dragon double her efforts to destroy the local Brotherhood, leading to Lyra capturing even more assassins and torturing them. However, the Brotherhood eventually also gets on the trail of the Black Dragon, and they started to put effort into trying to discover who this Black Dragon actually is, devoting several Brotherhood members to investigate her. Eventually, the Brotherhood found out that the Black Dragon worked for the Order of the Hour, and thus did some members, including the player, infiltrate the Order of the Hour's headquarters in an attempt to assassinate the Black Dragon as a revenge for all the assassins that they've killed. Now, when you sneak around the headquarters of the Order, you can meet an innocent-looking figure in drab grey clothing who introduces herself as Lyra and offers to bring you to the Black Dragon's quarters. During your conversation, you as the player aren't aware yet who you're dealing with, but of course we are, as we talked about the entire backstory to the questline. Now, in that context of you in the questline, this conversation with Lyra reveals that she's becoming slightly disillusioned with her current assignment, and as long as you stay friendly, she doesn't really attempt to kill you and simply reveals to you that the Black Dragon was once much like you, but that Akatosh teaches that nobody is beyond redemption. She then advises you to give up your search and run far away from everything that's happening and just find peace because you won't find it here, saying that that is what she should have done from the start. However, at this point one of your fellow assassins barges in and tries to set a trap for the Black Dragon. Seeing that she's getting outnumbered, Lyra then turns on the both of you. She reveals that she is the Black Dragon and assassinates your colleague assassin and then disappears. At this point, we don't know exactly what happened behind the scenes as we flee back to the Dark Brotherhood sanctuary, but it seems that Lyra talked to Primate Artorius about the doubts she was starting to form about the whole situation and arrangement as First Sword of the Hour, and her journal reveals that she was deeply conflicted by the point that we confronted her. And it seems that Primate Artorius at this point seems to have given her a similar speech as her former speaker back in the day, likely calling her a tool of his will to her face or something like that. Because Lyra, after this point, just gets completely disillusioned by the Primate and deserts the fight against the Dark Brotherhood, retreating to an ancient temple of Akatosh and ancient headquarters of the Order of the Hour, a place called Night's Grave. Here she contemplates her life as she found no redemption in worship and feels like she's ready to just die at this point. Right as the player and their fellow assassin Green Venomtongue, an Argonian assassin and crucially sole survivor of Lyra's old sanctuary other than her, enter Night's Grave to end the Black Dragon. As you make your way through the ancient temple complex, Lyra keeps telling you to turn back, says that she is done being used and doesn't want to kill any more people, especially not one of her few surviving comrades, as she didn't know that Green Venomtongue survived. Almost begging the two of you to turn away and leave her there, as she has been lied to by everyone and now just wants to be left alone, but you two persist. And if you do, she kills Green Venomtongue after revealing that it was Artorius who set her on the Brotherhood. Something the Brotherhood wasn't sure of at this point, as they seemed to think that the Black Dragon acted on her own. Now, you then face her in battle and defeat her, but it turns out that even Akatosh couldn't bring her redemption in the end, or perhaps he could, but her betrayal of the Order in the end led to her being abandoned by Akatosh. But anyway, upon her death, a mystical Wrath of Sithis appears and drags her soul to the void for eternal damnation for her betrayal of the Brotherhood. This is how her story ends. After the Brotherhood set her upon those that she loved most, and the one offering her redemption in her darkest hour lied to her, and now her soul is condemned forever by Sithis. She was quite a complex character who was thrown into conflicts not of her own making, and she ended up seeking redemption only to then be used yet again and finally be damned for eternity. It's quite the tragic story, and the fact that the Brotherhood impales Primate Artorius with his own staff not long after in revenge for setting the Black Dragon upon them, at least gives us some further closure on this story, and in a way, at least a small way to avenge Lyra, who, she was kind of a terrible person since she was a murderer, and I mean, Dark Brotherhood people just generally are murderers, so not that great people, but, they're protagonists in stories, so I guess we will want to avenge her. I don't know, I'll leave that up to you how you feel about that. That being said, the assassination of both Pirate Queen Fortunata and Primate Artorius left only one of the big three players of the Gold Coast power struggle alive, that was Count Carolus, who would then take on the rule of the entire region. The Dark Brotherhood would then continue to operate, and the player gets the title of Silencer for the Brotherhood from their speaker. And good all good. Except for Lyra, whose soul gets, eternal damnation. But hey, can't have them all. Anyway, that was the story of Lyra, Viria and Artorius Ponticus. Quite the good story if I say so myself, and their story makes the Dark Brotherhood DLC of The Elder Scrolls Online one of my personal favorites in the entire game. Anyway, next up, let's talk about one of the Second Era's more controversial figures. The last ruler of the Empire before everything went wrong, Empress Regent Clivia Tharn. Empress Regent Clivia Tharn. The last one to rule the Empire before the Elder Scrolls Online. Clivia Tharn was the 16th daughter of the Imperial Chancellor and Noble and Battle Mage of the Imperial Council, or Elder Council, Abner Tharn, and his 7th wife, a woman named Pelasia. I'm sorry, I'm not good with names. Not much is known about her early life, except for one little bit about when she played a game with her sister. The quote goes as follows. When she was 7 years old, Clivia played a board game known as Imperial War Chess with her sister Euryxia Tharn. Clivia played an illegal move, outraging her sister, who said that when she was the Queen of Rimmon, she would get hers. However, Clivia was unimpressed, stating that one day she would be Empress. This tells a little bit about her character, about, well, a little bit of arrogance, I would say. And amazing self-confidence. So, Clivia Tharn's story truly begins with the Longhouse Dynasty's last monarch, Leovic. More on him in the Reman Dynasty video. Leovic, then still Prince Leovic, came back from his first successful military expedition, and his father, Emperor Morgiah, said that as a reward, his son could pick whatever he wanted. He chose neither gold or a statue. No, to reinforce his claim when he would become emperor when his father died, he chose the hand of Clivia Tharn, the latest daughter of the Chancellor of the Elder Council, Abner Tharn. Abner Tharn would not have it. He would not have his daughter married to some Reachman emperor, Brute. However, it did not matter, since Emperor Morgiah overruled him and married off Leovic to Clivia Tharn.
When in the year 566 of the Second Era, Leovic's rule began, after the death of Emperor Morgiah, Clivia Tharn became Empress of the Cyrodiilic Empire, next to Emperor Leovic. However, his rule was very short, since he made a gruesome mistake very early on in his rule. The nobility of Cyrodiil had also always sort of supported the Longhouse Emperors, because they brought stability to Cyrodiil and the rest of the Empire. However, when Leovic tried to legalize Daedra worshipping in the Empire, a rebellion started. The Duke of Chorrol, Varon Aquilarius, led a popular rebellion against Emperor Leovic and was supported by a large part of the population and the Elder Council, including Abner Tharn, his most staunch supporter. When Emperor Leovic was overthrown and then killed by Varon Aquilarius, Abner Tharn was very grateful. He was grateful enough to let him marry his daughter, Clivia Tharn. He rewed Clivia Tharn to Varon Aquilarius to show his gratitude, but also to reinforce Varon Aquilarius' claim to the throne as emperor. And thus, Clivia Tharn was now the wife of Emperor Varon Aquilarius, and continued her reign as Empress of the Empire. Her husband Varon Aquilarius then set out on an epic quest with the 5 companions to find the Amulet of Kings, together with his 4 companions, one of which was the father of Clivia Tharn, Abner Tharn, and one other member of the 5 companions was the traitor, the conjurer Menomarco. When they found the Amulet of Kings 3 years later, Varon believed that due to a lie by Menomarco that it could turn him into Dragonborn, thereby legitimizing his and his children's rule forever, and reinforcing the barrier between Mundus and Oblivion. But as said, Menomarco was a liar. And when the 5 companions tried to turn Varon into Dragonborn, this went horribly wrong. Varon disappeared, and Menomarco used the event to shatter the barrier between Nirn and Oblivion instead of reinforce it. This event, where Varon disappeared, is called the Soul Burst. Menomarco then, assisted by Molag Bal, forced Abner Tharn and Clivia Tharn to swear fealty to him, making him the de facto ruler of the Empire. Clivia Tharn was immediately after the Soul Burst proclaimed Empress Regent and ruled the Empire for 3 more years. The Empire she ruled could have looked a bit like this. The Reach and High Rock were conquered by the Longhouse Emperors, and the Kingdom of Rimmon was under the rule of her sister, Aurasia Tharn, who was queen there. And Orenthia was invaded at Clivia's command, using the Westweld Legion of the Imperial Legion, headed by Javad Tharn. As you can hear, these 3 years the Empire was basically under the rule of the Tharn family, headed by Clivia and Abner, who were under the control of Menomarco, so making Menomarco the de facto ruler of the Empire. Clivia became, during this time, ever more under the control of Menomarco, as he entranced her with promises of immortality. She came further into his grip. This led Clivia to the life of a Daedra worshipper, as did the rest of her family, in service to Menomarco and Molag Bal. We can actually see how far it's gone within the Tharn family in one of the quests in Elder Scrolls Online, where a niece or a sister of Clivia Tharn, it's not really clear in the lore, actually says when the general says to her, "Glory to the Empire," she says, "No, glory to Molag Bal." This proves how far Daedric worshipping has gone into the family. In the days after the Soul Burst, she banished the Mages Guild from the Imperial City, blaming them for the disappearance of Varon. Because you must understand that there was a huge magical explosion when Varon Aquilarius disappeared after trying to turn himself into Dragonborn. This was blamed on the Mages Guild, as was the blame of his death. The worm cult of Menomarco then took on the old base of the Mages Guild for themselves, consolidating Menomarco's rule. However, after 3 years, her reign came to an abrupt end as the Plane Melt initiated. This was the next step in Molag Bal's effort to take over the world. 3 years since the Soul Burst, the first event, Molag Bal and Menomarco had been preparing to draw Tamriel into Molag Bal's plane of Cold Harbor. And now it happened. The Imperial City was attacked by Daedra, and dark anchors started appearing everywhere over the land. This is actually part of the main quest of Elder Scrolls Online, which I will tackle in another video, because otherwise this video would become way too long if I elaborated on everything. The Empire now quickly fractured, as the 3 major powers around the Empire, the Altmerry Dominion, the Daggerfall Covenant and the Ebonheart Pact, saw this chaos as their opportunity to conquer the Imperial City and parts of Cyrodiil. When the attack began, Clivia ordered all legions to retreat to Cyrodiil to help defend the province against the Daedra. This, however, was too late, as the Daedra had already overrun the Imperial Isle. Clivia was desperate to hold this island, sending an entire legion to their doom to try and retake the waterfront district. She became desperate, because in some dialogue during the White Gold Tower questline, we can actually see that she orders generals around against all their advices and just does whatever she thinks is best, and also tries to blackmail generals into submission. The heartland of Cyrodiil was quickly lost to the alliances, while the Legion kept fighting in the city as in a desperate last stand. Then, everything changed when a dark anchor opened over the White Gold Tower, and inside the city's walls there was also flooded with Daedra. There was no longer any possibility of defense against them. It was said that the Emperor's regent Clivia Tharn died there, defending the White Gold Tower, the last bastion of the Imperial City Legion. Some time passed, and without an Emperor's regent the Empire completely collapsed. The last days of her reign the Empire must have looked something like this. Actually, this is what I think that the Empire looks like during Elder Scrolls Online. With the Gold Coast independent, Cyrodiil's heart lost to the alliances, and no major cities within Cyrodiil under the control of the Legion, except for probably Leyawiin, since it's bordered by the kingdom of Rimmen, which is still imperial due to the niece or sister of Clivia ruling there as queen. During this time, most of the political power within the Empire probably crumbled away in the chaos, and the generals of the Legion were probably left to handle the de facto power over the Empire, or what remained of it. Rimmen and Leyawiin being a possible exception due to the rule of Clivia Tharn there as the queen. Cherim was kept, but the Imperial Legion faced a rebellious population there. Southern Bankerai was desperately held by Clivia's niece or her sister, Mage's general Septima Tharn, but was eventually driven out by the Daggerfall Covenant and the player of Elder Scrolls Online. Same story with Eranthia, which was still held by Javad Tharn and his Westweld Legion, but was thwarted by the Dominion and the player of Elder Scrolls Online, and also driven out. I think that without the major cities, this part will also quickly get lost to the alliances, since it's so, well, it's enclosed between the Gold Coast and the alliances themselves. The only part of the Empire that would probably remain would be the Blackwood region and Nibene, which would probably remain under the rule of Clivia Tharn as the Queen of Rimmen, the only stable Imperial bastion in the region. Therefore I also think that the Imperial generals that remain, we hear something of, well, the generals wouldn't give me any troops. I think that those generals are probably in Rimmen, since it's the only real powerful bastion of the Empire left. So that is probably where the so-called central command of the Empire is during the story of Elder Scrolls Online. After the attack on Cyrodiil, of course. But I can never, of course, be sure, since it's all speculation by me. Sometime after the plane melt, however, Clivia reappeared with a small detachment of soldiers, hoping to retake the White Gold Tower. This is actually the quest of the story ESO White Gold Tower dungeon. However, at the end of this dungeon, it turns out that it was not Clivia. Instead, it was Molag Kena, a servant of Molag Bal, trying to further the goals of the plane melt by pulling the White Gold Tower and the city into Cold Harbor. So this Molag Kena was, of course, disguised as Clivia Tharn. Because probably the real Clivia Tharn, as I said before, died during when the Dark Anchor appeared. However, I have some theories about that. The first one is that Clivia was already dead when the attack on the Imperial City by the Daedra commenced. That it was already Molag Kena in her body, put there by Markur and Molag Bal even before the plane melt, to get more power over the Empire. I think this because of the stupid and rash decisions he made during the defense we hear of during the White Gold Tower questline. Her decisions are not wise, they just quicken the Daedra in their march towards the cities and kill more soldiers and citizens. My second theory is that Molag Kena is actually just Clivia Tharn, who voluntarily became Molag Kena. Remember when I said that she became a staunch Daedra worshipper due to false promises by Markur? What if he promised her eternal life after this transformation, and she is already completely indoctrinated? And what if she's actually sane in this form, but just looking for more power for herself by allying with Molag Bal and put Tamriel into Cold Harbor, and then hoping that she would have some sort of power there or something?
I don't really know if any of these theories is true, but hey, let me know in the comments what you think. Next up, let's talk about a character whose very existence is shrouded in legend, the second emperor of the ancient Alessian Empire, Emperor Belharza, the first Minotaur to be emperor and wear the Amulet of Kings. Alright, so Emperor Belharza, the Minotaur Emperor, and according to legend, the first Minotaur. His story is quite interesting and starts well before his birth, back in the early years of the First Era. At this time, the humans of Cyrodiil lived as slaves under the oppressive rule of the Ayleid Empire. The Ayleid elves enslaved the humans to be used as tools, but the Ayleid Empire weakened eventually, and the humans of Cyrodiil rose up against their Ayleid masters in what was called the Alessian Slave Rebellion. This rebellion, which saw the humans free themselves and overthrow several Ayleid kingdoms, was led by a figure which now has mythical status, Slave Queen Alessia. Alessia, however, did not lead the rebellion on her own, for at her side were two great champions with now equal mythical status. The first to come to her was the demigod Morgiah, who was deemed to be a son of Cain and who appeared to the people as a large bull with wings, walking on its hind legs. The second champion of Alessia was the crusader Pelennor Whitestrake, who single-handedly took down armies of Ayleids according to the legends. Together they founded the Alessian Empire, of whom Alessia became the first leader, the first empress. And you may notice how I often use the words mythical status and according to legend, as all this stuff took place almost 3000 years before the events of the Elder Scrolls Online, and more than 4000 years before the events of Skyrim. If we count the Middle Dawn Dragonbreak, of course, and even if we don't, it's still more than 3000 years before Skyrim. Anyway, that is important to remember, as all we have on the Alessian Slave Rebellion are mythical stories. Sources on a lot of details are very fuzzy. So, although we can be fairly sure the story as I recounted it to you is the way that it most likely happened, there's still some fuzziness on details. Either way, what is important for the story that I'm telling you today is that Slave Queen Alessia was, according to the sources that we have, romantically involved with the demigod Morgiah, who again came in the shape of a large bipedal bull with wings, according to the most recent and vast majority of the sources. Their love spawned a child, which they named Belharza, who was half human like his mother Alessia and half bull like his father Morgiah. He was, according to legend, the first Minotaur to walk on Tamriel. Although there are some conflicting sources stating that Minotaurs were already on Tamriel by that time, but again this stuff all plays 3000 years before the Elder Scrolls Online and now has mythical status on Tamriel, so let's take it all with a grain of salt. What we are almost certain of is that Belharza was a Minotaur and that he was the son of Alessia and Morgiah, and there are sources saying that his horns were specifically distinct from his father Morgiah, who was a regular bull instead of a Minotaur. We even have this sketch of former Elder Scrolls developer Michael Kirkbride of what a young Belharza could have looked like, including a sketch of an older Belharza by the same guy. And as you can see in the sketch of the older Belharza, he's wearing the Amulet of Kings, which I took the liberty of giving a red shade. Anyway, he was indeed able to wear the Amulet of Kings as he carried Alessia's blood and was supposedly the first true bearer of the amulet when his mother passed away, as he, as her legitimate son, became the second emperor of the Alessian Empire. He wore the amulet after his mother's soul had been imbued within it by Akatosh and the divine pact to keep Mundus safe from the threat of Oblivion had been established. It is likely that he was the very first Tamrielic emperor to light the dragon fires at the imperial city, which was by then only recently conquered by the humans from the Ayleids. But his reign as emperor was not a peaceful one, as wars with the remaining Ayleid kingdoms continued to rage on, and it's said that Emperor Belharza fought on the front lines himself against the elves, together with other Minotaurs, who at this point were civilized citizens of the Empire and would continue to be so for several decades. Not much is known about his reign, but like I said, the closest reference point, Elder Scrolls Online, has his reign being almost 3000 years ago, but here's what we do know of his life. We know that he had quite a good relationship with his mother, Empress Alessia, as they often exchanged private letters as Belharza fought on the fronts while she was still alive, most likely ruling things from the imperial city. We know that he ascended to the throne in the year 266 of the First Era and that he died somewhere before the year 358, as then his son was in power. Because we know that during his lifetime he took a wife and he had a son named Amiel, who would succeed him as emperor. We do not know which race Amiel was, as with a union of mortals, customarily the race of the mother is the race of the child, with Belharza likely being an exception, due to his father Morgiah being a demigod and thus not a regular mortal, and thus Belharza became half man and half bull. Now here's the thing, one reason that we know so precious little about Emperor Belharza is because in the year 361 of the First Era, only 95 years after Belharza's ascension to the throne and his coronation, the Alessian Order, a sect of human extremists, became the dominant political power in the Alessian Empire. They persecuted elves, trying to wipe them from the empire, but also ousted other non-human races, among which were eventually the Minotaurs. At some point during their prominence, the Alessian Order banished Minotaurs from society, shunning them from society and branding them outcasts. This began the decline of Minotaurs from proud members of the Empire to the creatures that we see today. But it's not just the contemporary Minotaurs which they outcasted. The Alessian Order reportedly also removed all of Minotaur history from the Imperial history, among which was the history of Emperor Belharza, who was scratched from the history books by them, and even Morgiah, whom they tried to describe as human in newer history books instead of the winged bull demigod. Due to this effort by the Alessian Order to remove Emperor Belharza from history, all that remains from his rule are fragments, weathered etchings and scraps, but due to these scraps which the Alessian Order failed to destroy, we do know that he was there and that he was a Minotaur, and that he existed as Emperor. And if he truly is an ancestor to all Minotaurs, that would mean that all the Minotaurs have Alessian blood in them, but then again, this is all 3000 years ago from our nearest reference frame, Elder Scrolls Online, so it would be like me discovering I have the blood of an Egyptian pharaoh. I mean, yeah, maybe, but it's such a small percentage that it's insignificant. Also, if in a union of mortals the child always becomes the race of the mother, then Belharza, who is a male, would have a very low chance of ever making another Minotaur with a mortal woman. Again, we don't even know the race of his own son and whether he was Minotaur. So yeah, I kind of dispute the story of him being the first Minotaur and all, as we do have some stories of Minotaurs existing before that point, so... let me know what you think. Was he the first Minotaur? Was he not? We don't know. What we do know is that he existed, and that he was a Minotaur, and that he was an emperor over the early Alessian Empire. And that's the story of Emperor Belharza. Next up, let's talk about the final story in this long compilation of stories, the story of the enigmatic and mysterious time traveler, Thaddeus Cosma, who is by far the most mysterious character in the series that I've seen that almost no one talks about. So, let's talk about him. In the Elder Scrolls Online Greymoor chapter there have been some significant lore additions, but none puzzled me as much as the addition of Thaddeus Cosma. When you travel in Blackreach in the Elder Scrolls Online, you may happen upon an ancient Dwemer ruin called Nechutenkarst. This dungeon, for all terms and purposes, is a very curious one. When you approach the dungeon, you will find the adventurer Kireth Vanos, whom you are able to encounter in several other quests in the game. She tells you that she and her brother got contracted to investigate the ruin, but it turns out that a lot of strange things were going on in the ruin, and she decided against exploring the ruin after they've been ambushed by bandits who seemingly appeared from nowhere. Her brother, Rainer Vanos, however, decided to go in either way because he was curious as to what kind of secrets could be found in the ruin and what the cause could be for that strange popping in, claiming that the secrets of the Dwemer tonal magic itself may be waiting inside. You agree to help Kireth find her brother inside the ruin and then get him out. To no surprise, when you find him, he doesn't really feel like going as he wishes to research the ruins. He explains to you that the ruins are full of strange creatures and people that pop in and out of existence, and he wishes to find out the origin of this strange phenomenon. You then decide to explore the ruins together with the siblings, after promising Kireth to help keep her brother safe. And soon you'll also see what Rainer meant with people and creatures popping in and out of existence, because the whole ruin is full of strange distortions in time and space, with creatures from all geographic regions of Tamriel appearing in the ruins through strange portals of sorts, and then randomly disappearing again a few seconds after. You three explore the ruins for a bit, and then find a strange character standing in the ruins in full Dwemer armor and a strange hat. When you approach him, he recognizes you and says, "Ah, of course it's you. Couldn't have been anyone else, couldn't it?" Indicating that you two have already met. When you ask whether you two have already met, he essentially tells you that it depends on what year it is right now, and apparently you two are in a time when you haven't already met. But he refuses to tell anything more, as there's already enough temporal instability going on in the ruins without him making it worse. He then introduces himself as Thaddeus Cosma, and he refuses to really reveal anything more about himself, other than that he belongs to some sort of organization, but he refuses to elaborate on what kind of organization it is. All he says is that you have to help him find several parts to his mysterious machine, imploring you, Raynor and Kireth to help him find the parts and help close the strange temporal and spatial distortions around the ruins, because the machine can fix them, and he explains that if you don't fix them, the ruin might completely rip itself apart and become a very big problem, as that would kill all of you. He then shows you a list of parts, but just as you finish reading the list, Kireth and Raynor get ripped apart by the spatial distortions, disappearing in bright blue flashes. Today's Cosma then tells you that they can still be saved, but that for now they are lost, somewhere in space and time. Telling you that they could be anywhere, the Meravic era, the distant future, the very start of creation, but that for now there is no way to retrieve them until the distortions are fixed with his machine. So he tells you to quickly retrieve those parts. The quest itself isn't all too special, it's just a fetch quest, it's just random enemies and bosses, all from different provinces in the game. So yeah, just a fetch quest really. But over the course of the quest, the distortions seem to get worse, and you even meet both Raynor and Kireth during the quest, who seem to have distorted back to your time. When you meet Raynor, he tells you that he spent years in other periods of time, saying that the time is not a road to travel on, but rather a rope or a cable with many threads all bound together with no beginning or end for those who know how it works. And he says that he learned so much, but that he can't tell you anything yet, as time is of the essence, and that he got contacted by a group of people, who are likely from the same organization as today's Cosma, who then sent him back to that point in time, telling him that you would be there soon, and that the future version of Raynor can't stay here long, lest the present version cannot return. He then gives you the part that you need and implores you to hurry and save the present version of himself and his sister, who are still lost somewhere. Because this is apparently or a future or a past version of Raynor. Confusing? Yeah. You also meet the future version of Kireth during the quest, who also seems to have been sent to the present by Thaddeus' mysterious organization to help you get the part. But before you can talk to her, she disappears again in a spatial distortion. Just before getting the final part for Thaddeus, you actually see both Raynor and Kireth, both having been sent back from time again to help you get the parts, but this time they basically disappear just as you approach, and they barely recognize one another as you see them. Raynor seems almost confused, exclaiming, "Kireth, is that you? It's been so long." But both almost instantly disappear again, indicating that the distortions are getting so bad that Thaddeus' organization cannot keep them in the present as they get ripped away again. When you retrieve the final part, you approach Thaddeus Cosma again with all the parts that he needs to fix the spatial distortions. He tells you to hurry and help him fix the device, and when you help him fix the strange device, the spatial and temporal distortions suddenly disappear and Kireth and Raynor return to the present time. Just before Kireth and Raynor return, however, you have the chance to ask Thaddeus Cosma about himself and about his organization. He more or less reveals that part of the tasks of his organization is to fix distortions in time and space, but that he can't tell you anything more, as your understanding of how time and space works is still too fragile in your brain and that it's too rattled as it is. You then ask him whether he's from the future, but before he can give you a straight answer, he basically just laughs and then dematerializes and disappears. This is the end of his story so far, and when Kireth and Raynor return, they seem to have been returned to their past selves, only having vague memories of what happened, not remembering much of their years across time and space, and also not remembering that they helped you get the parts in the first place during your quest. All that Raynor remembers is talking to a strange group of people, likely Thaddeus' organization, but he doesn't remember any details. Kireth remembers a bit more, remembering to have been traveled both back and forward in time, remembering that it was all a sort of bad dream. But from what she tells you, she says that she saw Vivek City as a crater, having vague memories of falling into a volcano, indicating that, among other places, she got shot forward in time towards the Red Year, which is just a few centuries before Skyrim takes place, the game Skyrim of course. So that's basically the story of the quest. It's a pretty interesting one, but the implications of this questline are massive. While time travel was already a thing of sorts in the Elder Scrolls universe, the addition of Thaddeus and his organization is pretty much groundbreaking, if anything because it likely foreshadows a future Elder Scrolls Online expansion. You see, Thaddeus already claimed to have met you, asking what year it is because apparently you two will meet in the future, and will become pretty well acquainted judging from his "oh, of course it's you, how could it be anyone else" reaction. That means that it's likely that we'll encounter him a lot in a future chapter or DLC. Perhaps the next year-long storyline will revolve around him and his organization. Now, to get a bit more into the theory part of this video, Thaddeus, as we see him, is dressed in a form of Dwemer armor, but his hat is called the Menonaut hat, which is a hat that was used by legendary Riemann Empire Menonauts, essentially sort of astronauts but for exploration of other realms like Aetherius. Essentially the Riemann Empire space program, but that's a subject for a whole other video on its own someday. My personal speculation is that today's Cosma, who is an Imperial, is probably part of this Riemann Empire's Menonaut space program. Thus, I suspect that he didn't come from the future, but rather came from the past. So, if that's true, this means that the Menonauts probably operated across time and space, closing distortions and fixing other time-related issues. I suspect all this because the Menonaut hat in the game is used nowhere else in the game to my knowledge on an NPC, other than like a paid accessory for players. Meaning that the developer specifically gave him the Menonaut hat, likely even developing it and modeling it for today's Cosma. So, you see, that's my personal speculation, that he's actually from the past and part of the Riemann Empire Menonauts, and that we will meet him in some future DLC or chapter. It opens up a lot of possibilities, and one of the first ones that possibly came up in my mind is that we might actually get a Cyrodiil expansion in the past, where we actually interact with the Menonauts during the Riemann era, and perhaps even see some of the Riemann Emperors in person. But I mean, that's pretty far-fetched, as I'm always very bad at guessing where storylines will go in the future, so I won't elaborate on it more. Fortunately, I am pretty good at guessing where this long video is going to go, and that is to its ending sequence, because this is where I'll end the video. Perhaps one day I'll do another one of these interesting people compilations, because there are so more interesting people who definitely deserve to mention here, and yet aren't here, but I'll save them for part 2 someday, because some of those original videos badly need remasters due to either outdated lore or extremely bad narration, or didn't really fit in here, or, well, on the other hand, this is almost 3 hours, so maybe it's time to stop and save the rest for the next part. Or, you know, just watch the individual videos on my channel. There's a whole playlist of people of the Elder Scrolls lore that I did over the years. It's not complete with every person that it talks about, but it's pretty good. Although, be warned, there will be some very outdated narration in here. You got a sneak peek of that with the Clivia Tharn part of this video. Anyway, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, why not let me know in the comments what your favorite non-alcoholic drink is. Not only would it confuse other viewers if you say something like pineapple juice in the comments, it would also give me some inspiration to diversify my fridge beyond just cold water and fruit juice, which, I mean, they are all reliables, but I need some other things. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this large lore collection. Big shout out to my Patreon subscribers who you see on screen and make this all possible. And I hope to see you soon in either the next regular Elder Scrolls lore video this week, or in the next big lore collection, probably next month or the month after that. See ya!